The Sorcerer Supreme of DxD, Act 1, The Boy Who Saw Too Much, Chapter 1, The Weight of Two Souls. The first thing Issei Hyoudou knew was not warmth. It was not the soft, welcoming darkness that people described in near-death accounts, nor the gentle tunnel of light that promised peace on the other side of suffering. What he knew, at the very instant of his second birth, was the precise, crystalline weight of awareness pressing against the inside of his skull like a diamond set into living bone. He was aware of the woman breathing above him. He was aware of the exact temperature differential between his skin and the cold winter air of Kyoto. He was aware of his own heartbeat, each contraction a distinct mechanical event that he could count with the same ease a scholar counted syllables. He was also aware, in the dim but insistent way that memories belonging to a dead man can assert themselves against new flesh, that he had been here before. Not here, specifically. Not this hospital room with its antiseptic smell and the faint sound of a television murmuring news in the corridor. He had been born before. He had lived before. He had died before, somewhere mundane and embarrassingly ordinary, and the universe had seen fit to drop him back into the world without so much as an explanation. His name, in that previous life, had been Issei Hyoudou. He had been 17 years old, a student at Ko Academy, a devil in service to one Rias Gremory, and possessed of a sacred gear called the boosted gear that doubled his power every 10 seconds in combat. He had been optimistic, loud, and possessed of a constellation of interests that his teachers had found inappropriate for a school setting. He did not know what he was in this life. Not yet. He opened his eyes. The world came in not as a blur resolving into focus but as a completed picture, perfectly rendered from the first instant, every edge precise and every depth accurate. He could see the grain of the wooden ceiling beam above the hospital cot. He could see the individual fibers in the cotton blanket swaddling his infant body. He could see, with an awareness that had no right to exist in a newborn, the faint shimmer of something that was not quite light hanging in the air around every person in the room. It was not chakra. He knew chakra instinctively, the way a person who has studied a foreign language abroad comes home still hearing its rhythms in everything. This was something older and stranger. It moved in slow eddies through the air, heavier than chakra, more adhesive to living things, drawn toward negative emotion the way iron filings are drawn toward a magnet. It pulled in the corners of the room. It clung to the hem of the attending physician's coat. He catalogued it. He catalogued everything. This was the second thing he knew about himself in this new life. He could not stop perceiving. Where ordinary newborns received the world in overwhelming, undifferentiated floods of sensation, he received it in itemized clarity. Each stimulus assigned a position in a mental architecture that organized itself without his having to instruct it. He would later understand that this was the six eyes. In the present moment, it simply felt like being awake in a way that most people were not. The woman holding him was crying. Her tears fell at a rate of approximately 1 every 4 seconds. Her chakra signature was warm and faintly turbulent, edged with the particular quality he would come to recognize as the Uchiha bloodline. Her dark hair was damp at the temples. She had been in labor for 11 hours. He decided, in the private theater of his infant mind, that she was extraordinary. A man entered the room. Tall, angular, carrying himself with the precise economy of a soldier who had spent decades making his body do exactly what he required of it. His chakra was dense and controlled, banked like a furnace set to its lowest setting, radiating a steady heat that the six eyes read as immense suppressed power. His eyes were the deep, grieving black of the Uchiha crest. He looked at the infant in his wife's arms, and something in the architecture of his face shifted. Not softened, exactly. More like a wall that had not been expecting to meet something it could not categorize. The woman spoke. Her voice was low and exhausted and full of something that did not have a name, but that the six eyes identified as the complete surrender of a person who has decided to love something unreservedly. He has your eyes, she said. The man came to the bedside and looked down. His gaze was careful and assessing in the way of all shinobi, reading threat and potential in everything automatically, and then it reached something that stopped the assessment entirely. The infant was looking back at him, not the unfocused, reflexive gaze of a newborn tracking movement. A direct, steady, attentive look, the kind that belongs to a being that is already deciding what to make of you. Fugaku Uchiha stood very still for a moment. Issei, Mikoto said. I want to call him Issei. There was a pause that carried the weight of a man recalibrating his expectations of the future. Issei, Fugaku repeated, and whatever he had been planning to say about clan naming conventions did not come. The baby he was looking at had eyes the color of deep water lit from beneath, and they did not waver. The village of Konoha existed in a kind of layered reality that the six eyes perceived as a constant, low-grade symphony of information. Issei, who was 4 years old and sitting cross-legged on the roof of the Uchiha compound while his mother argued with a visiting clan elder somewhere below, had learned to appreciate the symphony rather than be overwhelmed by it. It had taken approximately 3 years of deliberate mental practice to reach this point. He was not unproud of the achievement. The village spread out before him in the late afternoon light, its rooftops and training grounds and markets arranged with the unconscious logic of a place that had grown organically around its own defensive needs. Through the six eyes, each living thing in his field of vision was a distinct point of light, the shinobi among them burning with the particular constrained brightness of trained chakra, the civilians warmer and more diffuse, and threading through everything, slow and unhurried as a river finding its course, the dark coiling weight of cursed energy. Most people could not see cursed energy. Most people in this world had never heard the term. It was not part of the vocabulary of the shinobi nations, which had built their entire metaphysical understanding around chakra and its applications. Cursed energy, as Issei had come to understand it through the accumulation of his previous life's memories and his current life's direct observation, was something different in kind. It was generated by negative human emotion. It accreted around places where people had suffered. It animated things that should not have been animated. It was, in short, the mechanism by which cursed spirits came to exist. He had seen his first cursed spirit at the age of 2.5. A small thing, roughly the size and shape of a cat, made entirely of compressed resentment and bad dreams, lurking in the shadow beneath the bridge at the southern edge of the market district. It had stared at him with its wrong eyes and he had stared back at it with his correct ones, and they had arrived at a mutual assessment without drama. He had not told anyone. He had catalogued it instead. By the age of 4, his catalogue contained 37 distinct cursed spirit entities observed within Konoha's walls, none of them large enough to threaten a trained shinobi, most of them barely coherent enough to sustain independent behavior. He noted their locations, their sizes, the qualities of their cursed energy signatures, and the rate at which they grew or diminished based on the emotional conditions of the surrounding population. He also noted that no one else could see them. This was, he concluded, because he had the six eyes. The six eyes, as he understood them from his previous life's second-hand knowledge of the jujutsu world, were not supposed to exist here. They belonged to a different cosmology, a different metaphysical architecture, a world where sorcerers and curses and binding vows were the operative vocabulary. He was not in that world. He was in the elemental nations, where chakra was the currency of power and the Sharingan was the Uchiha clan's inheritance. He had both. He had catalogued this also. The boosted gear announced itself when he was 4 years and 3 months old. He was training in the compound's inner courtyard, working through the basic taijutsu forms that Fugaku had begun teaching him with the seriousness of a man who believed that rigor in childhood was the foundation of capability in adulthood. The forms were simple. Issei performed them with the precision of someone who was paying close attention to the biomechanical logic of each movement, and extrapolating the principles, rather than simply memorizing the shapes. He threw a strike at the practice post. The air around his fist lit up with a deep, arterial red. He stopped. He held his fist up and looked at it. The gauntlet that had materialized around his arm from wrist to elbow was unmistakable. He had worn it in his previous life. He had grown it, modified it, learned its limits and its depths. The green jewel at the wrist pulsed once with a sound like a slow heartbeat. "Hey," said the voice inside it. Low and rumbling, with the particular register of something that had been old before most of what surrounded it had come into existence. "You are not who I was expecting." "No," said Issei, at 4 years and 3 months, in a voice too measured for his age. "I imagine not." There was a pause. "You remember?" "I do." Another pause, this one longer, carrying the texture of something that was recalibrating across a very large distance. The eyes are different, Drake said. Something is different about the eyes. 6 eyes, Issei said. It is a long explanation. I have been sealed in a sacred gear for a very long time, said the Welsh dragon. I have nothing but time. Issei looked at the practice post. He looked at the gauntlet around his arm. He thought about the cursed spirits moving through the village like shadows no one else could see, and the chakra that ran through his body like a river that had found its proper course, and the Sharingan that he had not yet awakened but could already feel waiting behind his eyes like a door that had not been opened. All right, he said. I will explain. He sat down cross-legged on the courtyard stones and began. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Perception. The conversation with Drake lasted 3 hours. This was, Issei reflected afterward, probably a record for a 4-year-old's uninterrupted monologue. He had explained his previous life, his death, the nature of the world he remembered, and his current assessment of the world he now occupied. Drake had listened with the focused attention of an entity that understood that information was worth more than commentary, and had asked precisely 4 questions, each one surgical in its precision. The first question, was he certain the 6 eyes were functioning as intended? The second question, had he yet determined the relationship between cursed energy and chakra in this world's metaphysical structure? The third question, was his family aware of the boosted gear? The fourth question, what did he want? The first 3 he answered with the catalog data he had been accumulating since birth. The fourth gave him pause. What did he want? He thought about his previous life. He thought about the boosted gear doubling his power every 10 seconds, an exponential engine that had eventually let him stand against beings that could crack mountains. He thought about the warmth of the Occult Research Club, about Rias and Aquino and Kaneko and Asia and all the complicated, layered humanity of the people he had fought alongside. He had wanted, in that life, to be a harem king. He had said so openly and often, with the cheerful shamelessness of someone who had decided that honesty about one's ambitions was preferable to pretension. He had been 17 and loud, and the world had been large enough to contain all of it. He was 4 now. The world around him was the elemental nations, which were not large in the same way but were deep in a different one, and the things moving through its shadows were not just devils and angels but something that in his previous life's cosmology had not had a name at all. Something generated by suffering. Something that accumulated in the darkness that human beings made inside themselves and let leak out into the world. What did he want? To understand it, he said finally. All of it. I want to understand what this is and why it is here and what it means that I can see it when no one else can. Drake was quiet for a moment. That is a more interesting answer than I expected from someone your size, the dragon said. I am aware of the irony, Issei said. The Sharingan awakened when he was 5. He was in the village with his mother, walking the market district in the early morning while the stalls were being set up and the air smelled of river water and fresh produce, and the particular dusty warmth of canvas being unrolled in sunlight. Mikoto was speaking to a vegetable seller. Issei was 3 steps behind her, watching the cursed energy in the market's shadows, cataloging the small grade 4 spirit that lived beneath the second stall from the left and had grown noticeably larger in the past month. He was not aware, at first, of the change in his eyes. He became aware of it because the world became more precise, more layered, more articulated in its information. The chakra signatures of everyone in the market lit up like lanterns, not just visible through the 6 eyes awareness but rendered in specific, nameable detail, each person's flow and pattern distinct as a fingerprint. The cursed energy in the shadows acquired depth and dimensionality it had not possessed a moment before. The Sharingan, which had been waiting behind his eyes like a door, opened. Mikoto turned around. She looked at her son standing very still in the middle of the market path, and her expression shifted into something careful and attentive. She had known this was coming. She had watched him since birth with the observant patience of a woman who had already decided that her child was unusual, and was waiting to understand in what specific ways. She moved to him, and crouched to his eye level. She looked at the tomos spinning slowly in his irises, 1 in each eye, the first awakening. Issei, she said, quietly enough not to be overheard. It is all right, he said. I am not distressed. She was quiet for a moment. She studied him with the calm directness that he had come to understand was the expression she wore when she was deciding how honest to be. What does it feel like? She asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Like being given more words for something I could already see, he said. Mikoto looked at him for another moment. Then she reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from his forehead, a gesture so ordinary and precisely maternal that something in his chest contracted with a warmth he did not have a category for. We should tell your father, she said. He will ask what triggered it, Issei said. And what will you tell him? He looked at the grade 4 spirit beneath the canvas stall, visible through the new layered depth of the Sharingan's perception, and thought about the answer. That I saw something I had not seen clearly before. This was true enough. Fugaku received the news with the studied composure of a man who had been rehearsing how to respond to his son's unusual nature since approximately the second week of his son's life. He sat in the study with Issei across from him and a cup of tea between them and asked careful, measured questions. How many tomo? One in each eye. Was there a specific emotional trigger? Issei described what he had seen without mentioning the cursed spirits, which was an omission he had decided on deliberately. Was there pain? No. Did the chakra cost feel significant? It did not. Fugaku was quiet for a while after that, turning the information over with the systematic thoroughness of a man who was also the chief of a clan and therefore accustomed to evaluating the strategic implications of things. The academy, he said finally. You will begin next year. Ahead of the standard age. I know, Issei said. Another pause. You read the curriculum documents I keep in the study, Fugaku said. It was not a question. The filing cabinet has a standard lock, Issei said. I was curious. Fugaku picked up his tea. He drank it. He set it down. The Uchiha name carries weight in this village, he said, with the particular cadence of a person beginning a conversation they had been planning for some time. Weight of history. Weight of expectation. Weight of things that have not yet resolved themselves. Issei waited. I am telling you this because you are clearly capable of understanding it, and because I prefer that you hear it from me rather than encounter it unexpectedly. I appreciate that, Issei said. The study was quiet. Outside, the compound's trees moved in a light wind. Somewhere in the village, a bell marked the hour. You will need to be careful, Fugaku said. With what you can do. With what you can see. This village does not always respond well to things it cannot categorize. Issei thought about the cursed spirits that had been accumulating in Konoha's shadows for 5 years, unseen and unaddressed, growing slowly on the village's ambient negative emotion. I understand, he said. He was 5 years old, and he was beginning to understand that understanding a problem and being able to address it were two different things that required different preparations. He began preparing. Chapter 3. A new kind of seal. Fuinjutsu, Issei discovered at the age of 6, was the closest thing that existed in this world to what he would have called sorcery in his previous one. It was the art of binding meaning into form. It was the discipline that recognized, on some level that its practitioners might not have been able to articulate precisely, that reality could be negotiated with if you could find the right language. A seal was a conversation with the fundamental structure of the world, a written proposal that, if correctly argued, the world would agree to. He loved it immediately and completely. He had begun studying on his own, pulling books from his father's shelves in the clan library with the methodical appetite of a student who has found the subject that was always waiting for him. The basic seals he absorbed in days. The intermediate theory he worked through in weeks. By the time he was formally introduced to the Academy's Fuinjutsu curriculum, he had already moved beyond what the curriculum covered and was working on things that the curriculum did not acknowledge as possible for his age group. The problem he had set himself was this: cursed energy was not chakra. The two forces operated on different frequencies, followed different rules, responded to different inputs. The shinobi arts were built entirely around chakra. There was no existing framework for working with cursed energy in this world because, as far as the world's established knowledge was concerned, cursed energy did not exist. Therefore, he needed to build the framework himself. This was, he acknowledged to Drake during one of their evening conversations, a significant undertaking for a 6-year-old. You are not a standard 6-year-old, Drake pointed out. That is true, Issei said. But I am working with an incomplete theoretical base. I know how cursed energy functions in the world I came from. I know how chakra functions in this world. What I do not know is how they interact in a system that was not designed to contain both. Then find out empirically. I have been. He spread a ceiling diagram on the floor of his room. It was 3 times the standard complexity for a student his age, incorporating elements from basic chakra seals, theoretical notes he had extrapolated from the 6 eyes perception data, and annotations in a cipher he had invented himself to prevent accidental discovery. The problem is that every time I tried to create a containment seal for cursed energy using standard chakra-based architecture, the seal degrades. The cursed energy corrodes it. Because cursed energy is antithetical to positive intention, Drake said. Your seals are built on will and directed positive force. Cursed energy is generated by the opposite. Issei looked at the diagram. He looked at the specific points where his theoretical seal structure had, in his mental models, shown stress fractures. I need a different binding principle, he said slowly. Not one that opposes the cursed energy. One that recognizes it. That speaks its language instead of trying to impose a foreign grammar on it. The dragon was quiet. Yes, said Drake. Issei picked up his brush. He began to revise. The first successful cursed energy containment seal took him 4 months to develop and 3 attempts to execute correctly. He tested it in the grove at the eastern edge of the Uchiha compound, where a grade 4 spirit had been residing in the hollow of an old tree for as long as he had been tracking it. He set the seal into the ground around the tree's root system with the careful, deliberate hand of a craftsman who understood that his work could not be approximated, and then he stepped back and channeled a measured amount of chakra through it. The seal lit up. Not in the blue-white of standard chakra-powered seals, but in a color that occupied the visual space between deep red and absolute black, a resonance frequency that the 6 eyes read as the signature of something that had learned to speak 2 languages simultaneously. The cursed spirit in the tree made a sound. Not a loud sound, more of a conceptual protest, the spiritual equivalent of something being compressed, and then it was contained. Issei stood and looked at what he had built for a long moment. Well, he said. That is new, said Drake. Yes. He crouched and examined the seal from close range, tracing the lines with his eyes rather than his fingers. The architecture held. The cursed energy within the containment was stable, neither growing nor degrading. I think the key was treating the cursed energy as a participant in the binding rather than a subject of it. The seal does not restrain the spirit. It creates a mutual agreement, a binding vow, Drake said. Issei looked up. The term landed with the weight of something that had been waiting to be named. Yes, he said. A binding vow written in seals. He was 6 years old. He had just invented something that did not have a precedent in either of the 2 worlds whose knowledge he carried. He wrote it up in the cipher notebook and labeled it Resonance Architecture, Series 1. The 3rd Hokage saw the notebook 8 months later. This was not planned. Issei had been called to the Hokage's office along with several other advanced students for a supplementary assessment, the kind of periodic check that the Hokage conducted personally with children who showed unusual potential. He had brought the notebook because he brought it everywhere, it being a working document rather than a finished one. He had not anticipated that Hiruzen Sarutobi would ask to see what he was working on. He had not anticipated that the old man's expression, already attentive, would become something altogether more focused when the notebook was opened. The Hokage studied the pages for a long time. He turned them with the careful hands of a man who understood that sealing theory was an art, and that the quality of a seal diagram could be read the way a musician reads a score. These are not standard forms, the Hokage said. No, sir. The outer ring architecture is Uzumaki influenced, but the inner binding logic follows a principle I have not seen before. He turned to the page labeled Resonance Architecture, Series 1, 3-ring variant. This 3-ring structure. What is the theoretical basis? Issei considered how much to explain. He had prepared for this possibility, not specifically but generally, having understood since early childhood that his work would eventually attract attention that required some account of itself. The outer ring creates the initial boundary, he said. Standard chakra architecture. The middle ring is what I call the resonance layer. It does not oppose what it contains. It matches the frequency of the contained element, and creates a stable interface. The inner ring is the binding itself, which operates on the principle that two parties in mutual resonance can enter into a stable agreement. The Hokage looked at him. You are 6 years old. 7 in 2 months, sir. The old man was quiet for a while. He set the notebook down and leaned back in his chair and looked at Issei with the eyes of someone who had been reading people for a very long time and had arrived at a conclusion he was not yet prepared to share. Your father, he said finally? Does he know about this notebook? He knows I study Fuinjutsu extensively. He has not seen the specific work. I think, the Hokage said carefully, that he should. Issei picked up his notebook. I think so too, he said. I have been trying to find the right moment. The third Hokage looked at him for another moment with that expression that Issei had catalogued as the look of a man who was revising his model of a thing in real time. Come and see me when you have more of Series 2 ready, the old man said. Yes, sir. He left the office with the awareness, confirmed by the 6 eyes reading of the ambient emotional field, that the Hokage would be thinking about that notebook for some time. Chapter 4. The Dragon Beneath the Sharingan. The Uchiha massacre did not happen. This was, Issei understood with the cold clarity of someone who had known it was coming and had spent years thinking about what he could do about it, the most significant deviation from the history he remembered. In the world of his previous life's memories, the massacre had been a tragedy written in fire and grief and the specific cruelty of necessity. A boy named Itachi made to carry something no one should have been asked to carry. A village's fear collapsing into preemptive violence. He had begun, at the age of 6, to work on the problem. Not directly. He was 6, and the political dynamics of the Uchiha-Konoha relationship were operating on a level that could not be addressed through the direct action of a child, no matter how unusual the child. But Fuinjutsu was, at its foundation, the art of changing the conditions of a system rather than confronting its symptoms. He did not need to address the distrust between the Uchiha and the village leadership directly. He needed to change the conditions that generated the distrust. The cursed spirits were part of it. This was something he had been building toward for 2 years of careful observation and cataloging. The cursed energy in Konoha accumulated primarily in 3 areas: the memorial stone at the edge of the village, where grief concentrated most heavily; the administrative district, where the particular corrosive weight of political anxiety had been building since the Nine Tails attack; and the Uchiha compound, where resentment and alienation had been layering year upon year like sediment. The cursed spirits that lived in the Uchiha compound were larger than the ones elsewhere in the village. They fed on the compound's accumulated negative emotion the way fires feed on available fuel, and their presence in turn made the compound feel subtly worse, subtly heavier. A feedback loop that no one in the compound could have named but that everyone in it was experiencing. He had, over 2 years of careful incremental work, been sealing them. Not dramatically. Not in ways that drew attention. He was a child moving through the compound on ordinary business, sitting in places where he had left preparatory seal marks in previous visits, completing binding structures that had been assembled over months of patient work. Each sealed spirit reduced the ambient cursed energy load in that area of the compound by a measurable amount. Each reduction made the people living there, marginally but genuinely, less likely to exist in the specific emotional register that generated the most damaging cursed spirits. It was slow. It was indirect. It was the kind of work that could not be demonstrated or explained without revealing things he was not ready to reveal. But it was working. He told his father about the notebook when he was 7, sitting in the study in the early morning before anyone else in the compound was awake, with the precise sealing diagrams spread between them on the desk. Fugaku was quiet for a very long time. He was quiet in the specific way of a man who is processing something that has reconfigured the landscape he thought he was standing in. Issei waited with the patience he had developed over years of understanding that forcing a person's processing was less efficient than allowing it to complete. The resonance architecture, Fugaku said finally. You have tested these. Yes. On what? A pause. A decision. There are things in this village, Issei said carefully, that accumulate in areas of high negative emotion. They are not chakra constructs. They are not summons. They are something different, generated by the specific quality of human suffering rather than directed will. He paused. I can see them. I have been able to see them since birth. The seals I have been developing are capable of containing them. Fugaku looked at his son. He looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man running through the implications of a piece of information and finding that each implication opened onto several more. Since birth, he said. Yes. And you have been working on this since you were 6. 5, for the theoretical work. 6 for the first practical tests. Another silence. Outside, the compound's earliest risers were beginning to move, the sound of footsteps on stone paths filtering in through the shuttered windows. Is there one in this room? Fugaku said. Issei looked. He looked with the 6 eyes and the Sharingan both, the layered perception giving him a complete read of the study's spiritual atmosphere. No, he said. This room is clean. I sealed the one that was here approximately 8 months ago. Fugaku sat with this information. You sealed something in my study 8 months ago. It was a grade 4. Relatively small. I used the loose floorboard under the reading chair. You have not moved the chair since, so the seal has remained intact. The silence that followed this was different from the previous ones. It had the quality of something arriving at a kind of peace with itself. All right, Fugaku said. Show me everything. Issei began to explain. The boosted gear revealed itself to Fugaku by accident. They were in the training yard 2 weeks after the study conversation, working through the advanced taijutsu forms that Fugaku had been teaching him, when Issei pushed his chakra through the gear's resonance point without intending to and the gauntlet materialized. Fugaku stopped mid-form. He looked at the red armor covering his son's right arm from fist to elbow. He looked at the green jewel pulsing with slow light at the wrist. That, he said, is not a chakra construct. No, said Issei. It is a sacred gear. It is from a different metaphysical system entirely. I was born with it. Drake, who had remained tactfully silent during the conversation about seals, now spoke. His voice emerged from the jewel at a volume audible to both of them, low and definitive. I am Drake, the Welsh dragon said. I am the Red Dragon Emperor, sealed within the boosted gear. Your son carries me as his partner. Fugaku Uchiha, head of the Uchiha clan, veteran of 2 great wars, a man whose composure was one of the most reliable things about him, was quiet for approximately 5 seconds. Then he looked at Issei. How long has the dragon been talking to you? Since I was 4, Issei said. I apologize for not mentioning it sooner. I was working on how to explain it. His father rubbed his face with one hand. It was, Issei noted, one of the very few times he had ever seen his father perform a gesture that was purely a coping mechanism rather than a deliberate choice. You were working on how to explain it, Fugaku repeated. It is a complex situation. Drake made a sound that was, in context, probably a laugh. He is telling the truth, the dragon said. It is genuinely complex. Fugaku looked at the jewel. He looked at his son. He made a decision, visible in the set of his shoulders, to treat this the way he treated all complex tactical situations, by gathering complete information before drawing conclusions. Tell me about the sacred gear, he said. Everything. They were there for 3 hours. By the end of it, the sun had moved significantly across the training yard and Fugaku had asked 47 questions, which Issei counted because counting things was a habit he had never managed to stop. At the end, his father was quiet for a while. You have 2 power systems that most shinobi would consider independently exceptional, Fugaku said. The Sharingan of the Uchiha line, and a sacred gear that doubles your power at 10-second intervals. You have a perception ability that lets you see things no one else in this world can see, which you have been using to quietly address an invisible spiritual problem in this compound for 2 years. And you have developed a new branch of Fuinjutsu theory to handle an element of reality that the existing field does not acknowledge. A pause. You are 7 years old. I know, Issei said. Your grandfather is not going to believe this. I thought, said Issei, that we might table the extended family conversation for the moment. For the first time in Issei's memory, his father almost smiled. Chapter 5. What the Eyes Reveal. He awakened 2 tomo in each eye the month before academy enrollment, which was earlier than the clan record showed for any Uchiha in 3 generations. The occasion was not dramatic. He was in the grove, working on a new ceiling series, when the second tomo slid into place in his perception with the quiet click of something completing itself. The world, already precisely rendered by the 6 eyes in the existing Sharingan, acquired a new layer. The flow of chakra in living things became not merely visible but readable in finer detail, each fluctuation carrying meaning the way a skilled musician hears intention in a single note. He sat with it for a while, mapping the additional data. Then he went back to work on the seal. The seal he was working on was the most ambitious project he had yet attempted. He was calling it the resonance domain, though the name was provisional and the theory behind it was still being refined. The concept drew on something he remembered from his previous life, the domain expansion of Jujutsu Kaisen, the technique by which a sorcerer imposed their own bounded reality on a defined space and achieved guaranteed accuracy against any target within it. He could not perform a domain expansion. He was 7 years old with limited chakra reserves and a Fuinjutsu theory that was still, by his own assessment, in its early stages. But the conceptual architecture of a domain expansion and the conceptual architecture of a very advanced seal were, he was increasingly convinced, expressions of the same underlying principle, the creation of a space in which the practitioner's will was law. The difference between a domain expansion and a seal was the medium. A domain expansion was expressed through the sorcerer's body and cursed energy, instantaneous and temporary, burning through resources at an enormous rate. A seal could be built slowly, carefully, over time, its cost distributed across the labor of construction rather than concentrated in a single explosive instant. What he was working on was a seal that, when activated, would create a localized zone of resonance architecture. Within the zone, any cursed spirit or cursed energy construct would find itself in a space where the binding logic of his Fuinjutsu was the ambient rule rather than the exception. It would not hit automatically, the way a full domain expansion would. But it would heavily favor his methods over the opponent's. He was calling it, provisionally, the infinite boost domain. The name referenced the boosted gear because the theoretical function was similar, a system that compounded advantage over time, creating an environment where the practitioner's power kept increasing relative to everything else in the space. You are thinking about combat applications, Drake observed. I am thinking about all applications, Issei said. Combat is one of them. Containment is another. The cursed spirits in this village are going to keep growing as long as the conditions generating them are not addressed. Eventually something large enough to be a genuine threat is going to emerge. When that happens, having an environment where I can guarantee effective intervention seems important. You are 7. You keep pointing that out. I keep finding it remarkable, the dragon said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite the same as the dry, measuring tone he usually employed. Something that might, in an entity of different temperament, have been called pride. Issei kept working on the seal. The day before the academy enrollment, Mikoto found him in the garden at dusk. He was sitting on the garden wall, the way he often did in the evenings, watching the light change and cataloging the cursed energy movements in the surrounding district with the routine attention of long habit. The work was mostly maintenance now, the compound much cleaner than it had been 2 years ago, the remaining spirits smaller and less coherent, the ambient emotional weight of the Uchiha quarter measurably lighter by several indices he had developed for tracking it. His mother sat beside him on the wall. She did not say anything for a while. This was one of the things he valued about her, the understanding that silence was sometimes the right medium for a particular kind of communication. The sky above Konoha went through its early evening colors, amber and rose and then the deep blue that precedes dark. Are you nervous? She said finally. He considered the question honestly. About the academy, no, he said. About being around that many children at once, slightly. The social dynamics of peer groups are less predictable than I tend to prefer. Mikoto laughed. It was a quiet sound, more breath than voice, the kind of laugh that comes from genuine surprise rather than performance. You are worried about the social dynamics, she said. I am aware that my experience of the world does not map well onto the typical experience of someone my age, he said. Making that work in a classroom setting requires adaptation. She was quiet for a moment. You have always known things you should not have known yet, she said. Since you were born. I used to watch you in your crib and think that you were having a very thorough conversation with yourself. He smiled. It was a small expression, but genuine. I was, he said. With the dragon? Not at that age. At that age it was more. He considered how to describe it. The process of organizing what I was perceiving. The world is very loud when you can see all of it at once. I was learning to turn the volume down. She was quiet again. The stars were appearing now, one and then several and then many, the night sky of the elemental nations clean and enormous above the village. Issei, she said? Yes. Whatever it is that you are building. A pause. I know it is large. I know it is more than you have explained to anyone, including your father. I know that the way you look at things means you are always working on several levels at once. She looked at him, and in the evening light her eyes were very dark and very steady. Whatever it is, do not forget to let people in while you are building it. That is all. He looked at her. The 6 eyes read her chakra signature as warm and worried and completely without reservation. The Sharingan rendered her expression in the precise, unambiguous language of absolute sincerity. He thought about his previous life. He thought about the people he had let in, eventually and imperfectly and with a great deal of noise, and what it had meant to have them. I will try, he said. She reached over and put her hand over his, the way she had when he was very small, and they sat together on the wall while the village settled into evening around them. Tomorrow, the academy. Tomorrow, the beginning of the next phase. The cursed energy in the garden was quiet. The boosted gear pulsed once, slow and steady, in the back of his awareness. The Sharingan registered everything. He was ready. Act 2. The weight of gifted things. Chapter 6. The first day of everything. The Konoha Ninja Academy smelled like chalk dust, old tatami, and the particular concentrated chakra of a building that had hosted several hundred children per year for multiple decades. Issei catalogued all of it within the first 8 steps through the front entrance, along with the 31 other children who had arrived for the early enrollment cohort, the 4 instructors visible from the corridor, and the faint, thin presence of a grade 5 cursed spirit that had made its home in the gap between the ceiling and the roof of the eastern classroom. He noted the grade 5 for later. It was barely more than a smear of residual negative emotion, not coherent enough to be a genuine threat, but persistent enough to warrant addressing at some point. He found his assigned classroom and took a seat near the window, which gave him a useful lateral view of the room and direct access to the light that made seal work easier to see when he was reviewing diagrams during lectures. He settled his bag beneath the desk. He waited. The classroom filled gradually. He observed the arrivals with the systematic attention of long habit, categorizing each student by their chakra signature, their posture, and the small behavioral data points that indicated things about training background, confidence levels, and the specific quality of anxiety that distinguished a child who was excited from one who was frightened. Most of them were excited. A few were frightened. One was spectacularly indifferent to the emotional register of the room entirely. He noticed the indifferent one because indifference of that quality was unusual. The boy who came in and took a seat 2 desks to his left had the chakra signature of someone with genuinely exceptional reserves and the careful, contained posture of a person who had already spent years learning to make himself take up less space than his nature wanted to occupy. Dark hair, pale eyes, and an expression of such comprehensive neutrality that it required actual effort to maintain. The 6 eyes registered something interesting behind the neutral expression. Not hostility, not boredom. Something more like the watchful patience of a person who had been disappointed by things before and was waiting to assess whether the current situation merited something different. Interesting. The boy looked over and found Issei watching him. They regarded each other for approximately 3 seconds. The boy looked away first, but not in the way of someone conceding. More in the way of someone who had completed a preliminary assessment, and found it inconclusive. Issei looked back at the front of the classroom. Across the room, a girl with pink hair and a girl with pale eyes were already deep in an argument about something that appeared to involve seating proximity to a third boy who had arrived early and was currently unaware of being the subject of the argument. The pink-haired girl had the particular quality of chakra that Issei had come to associate with exceptional theoretical intelligence directed primarily at social calculation. The pale-eyed girl had the signature of old money and significant training, and the specific frustration of someone who was accustomed to winning things. He catalogued both of them. The instructor arrived. Middle-aged, solid, the chakra of a veteran with field experience written into the economy of his movements. He introduced himself as Irika-sensei and surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone who had done this many times and was already making preliminary groupings in his head. His gaze landed on Issei and stayed there for a moment longer than it had on anyone else. Issei, who was accustomed to this, waited. Irika moved on and began the introductory lecture. In the gap between the ceiling and the roof, the grade 5 cursed spirit stirred and settled again, invisible and unhurried, tending its small grievance against the light. The curriculum was not challenging. This was not a complaint, simply an observation. The academy was designed to bring a wide range of students up to a common baseline, and a common baseline had to be set at a level that the majority could achieve with sustained effort. He was not the majority. He worked through the coursework with the focused efficiency of someone completing necessary groundwork before moving on to the actual project, attending to each subject completely while it was in front of him, and then releasing it. What was interesting was the other students. People were interesting. He had always found people interesting in his previous life too, though his previous self had expressed that interest with considerably more volume, and considerably less precision. In this life, the interest was quieter and more careful, but it was real and it went deep. The Sharingan saw the emotional truth of a face with the same involuntary completeness that the six eyes saw cursed energy, and the combination meant that every person he met was readable in ways that they did not know and had not consented to. He tried to use this gently. He tried to observe rather than exploit. He tried, as his mother had asked him, to let people in. The boy with pale eyes was named Sai. He had no clan name. He sat through lectures with the same comprehensive neutrality he had arrived with, took notes in a small precise hand, and did not speak to anyone unless addressed directly. When addressed, his responses were technically correct and socially adjacent to normal in a way that suggested someone who had learned the rules of social exchange from a textbook rather than lived experience. Issei found him compelling in the way that unusual things were compelling. On the third day, he sat down beside Sai at the lunch break and opened his sealed notebook. Sai looked at the notebook. He looked at the diagrams, which were dense with a notational system he clearly did not recognize. He looked at Issei. "What is that?" he said. "Fuinjutsu theory," Issei said. "Advanced? Some of it I developed myself." A pause. "Why are you showing it to me?" "Because you looked at it with the expression of someone who wants to understand it rather than someone who is performing curiosity. Those are different things." Sai was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the notebook again. "The notation in the outer ring," he said. "That is not standard." "What does the triple bar symbol mean?" Issei told him. Sai listened with absolute attention and asked a follow-up question that was 3 levels deeper than the initial answer. Issei answered that too. Sai asked another question. They talked through the entire lunch period and were late to the afternoon session by 4 minutes. Irika-sensei looked at them when they came in. He looked at the sealed notebook under Issei's arm. He had the expression of a man who was deciding how much to make of something. He made nothing of it and continued the lecture. Sai sat 2 desks away from Issei for the rest of the week, and then 1 desk away, and then beside him, and at no point in this gradual migration did either of them acknowledge that it was happening. The girl with the pale eyes was named Hinata Hyuga. She had the Byakugan, which the 6 eyes identified as a perception ability of a different architecture from his own, focused primarily on chakra point mapping and field of view expansion rather than the informational density of the 6 eyes, but sophisticated in its own right, and clearly backed by significant inherited refinement over generations. Her chakra reserves were considerable. Her confidence was not. She spent the first 2 weeks of the academy session watching Issei from the corner of her vision, which he was aware of and which he attributed to the natural attention that unusual things attract, until the day she fell during the basic balance exercises and he caught her arm before she hit the ground. It was an automatic response, his body moving on the Sharingan's predictive processing before his conscious mind had issued any instruction. He had her arm and she had her balance, and they were both standing before either of them had processed what had happened. She turned red. This was, he noted, a very complete and immediate physiological response. "Are you all right?" he said. Ah, yes. Thank you? I am sorry. She was looking somewhere in the vicinity of his collarbone. I lost my balance. The balance exercise is poorly sequenced, he said. The footwork requires hip rotation before the weight transfer is stable. Most of the class is compensating with upper body movement, which is why the failure rate is higher than it should be. A pause. She looked up at him, just briefly, with an expression that had surprise in it. You noticed that, she said. I notice most things. He released her arm. The correction is to initiate the rotation from the lower back rather than the hips. Would you like me to show you? She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular courage of someone who has to work to overcome a very strong reflexive hesitation, she said yes. He showed her. She corrected her form. She completed the exercise without falling. She did not look at him from the corner of her vision after that. She looked at him directly, in the careful, earnest way of someone paying close attention, and sometimes she asked questions that were thoughtful and precise and that he answered with the same seriousness with which she posed them. He added her to the small, carefully maintained list of people he was allowing to be close. Chapter 7. The Shape of Arrival. 3 months into the academy term, the pale-eyed girl from the first day introduced herself. Her name was Karen Uzumaki, distant relation to the Uzumaki of Whirlpool, orphaned young and placed with a distant family connection in Konoha's civilian district. She had the particular dense, almost aggressive vitality of the Uzumaki bloodline, her chakra signature a continuous low-frequency hum that the Six Eyes identified as remarkable reserves for her age, and she moved through the world with the pointed precision of someone who has decided that the best defense against being overlooked is to make themselves impossible to miss. She introduced herself by sitting across from Issei in the library and placing a seal diagram on the table between them. Tell me what is wrong with this, she said. He looked at it. It was a standard mid-level containment seal, competently drawn, with one structural error in the binding layer that would cause the seal to degrade under sustained load. He pointed to the error. She looked at it. She looked at him. I have been trying to find that for 2 weeks, she said. The binding layer assumes uniform pressure distribution, he said. In practice, the containment load concentrates at the cardinal points. The matrix needs compensatory reinforcement here, here, and here. She was already writing corrections. How do you know that? She said without looking up. I spent a significant amount of time building seal structures that failed for exactly that reason, he said. Empirical learning. She looked up at that. Her eyes behind their oversized glasses were sharp and measuring. You are the Uchiha who has been working on independent Fuinjutsu theory, she said. Iruka-sensei mentioned it to the advanced theory instructor, who mentioned it to everyone. People have opinions about it. What kind of opinions? Most of them are impressed and a few of them are skeptical, and one of them said the notation system was quote incoherent, which I think means they could not read it. The notation system is a cipher, he said. It is intentionally non-standard. She stared at him. You wrote your theoretical work in a cipher. Parts of it. The sections I was not ready to share. A pause during which she appeared to be deciding something. I want to work on seal theory with you, she said. Not as a student. As a collaborator. I have been working on Uzumaki Fuinjutsu restoration, trying to recover and reconstruct techniques from the partial records that survived the Whirlpool destruction. Some of what I have found does not fit the standard theoretical frameworks, and I think your non-standard framework might be relevant. He looked at her. He read her chakra signature, which was completely direct, carrying no secondary agendas or concealed calculations. He read her face, which had the straightforward intensity of someone who was accustomed to asking for exactly what they wanted because they had learned that indirection was a waste of time they did not have. Show me the Uzumaki records, he said. She produced a scroll from her bag. It was old, the edges fragile, the ink faded in places to near illegibility. She set it on the table with the specific carefulness of someone handling something irreplaceable. He looked at it. The notation was ancient Uzumaki standard, predating modern Fuinjutsu convention by several centuries, and it was unlike anything in the Academy library. But the underlying logic, the structural principles visible beneath the archaic notation, resonated with something in the non-standard framework he had been building, not because his framework came from the same tradition, but because they had arrived at similar conclusions from entirely different directions. He looked up. This uses a resonance principle, he said. The binding logic treats the sealed element as a participant rather than a subject. Karen went very still. Yes, she said. I have never seen anyone else identify that. I have been building toward the same architecture independently, he said. From a different theoretical starting point. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that had something unfamiliar in it, something that the six eyes identified as the specific quality of a person who has been working alone for a very long time, and has just found company in an unexpected place, she said. I think we need a longer table. The collaboration began in the library and moved to the training grounds and eventually to the small study room in the academy basement that Irika-sensei unlocked for them after examining 15 minutes of their working materials and deciding that whatever they were doing, they needed space for it. Karen worked with the obsessive focus of someone who had lost something important, and was reconstructing it one recovered fragment at a time. The Uzumaki records she was working from were incomplete, damaged by time and the violence of Whirlpool's destruction, and the restoration process required both deep knowledge of existing Fuinjutsu theory and a willingness to extrapolate intelligently from context clues. She was good at both. She was better at the extrapolation than almost anyone he had encountered. He brought to the collaboration the non-standard architecture he had been developing, the resonance principles and the binding vow theory and the three-ring structural model that the Hokage had noticed in the notebook. Where Karen was reconstructing a lost tradition, he was building a new one, and the two projects turned out to share foundations in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. Sai began joining them in the third week, initially to observe and then, with the gradual increasing engagement of someone who has found a problem he cannot stop turning over, to contribute. His contribution was different from either of theirs. He had no formal Fuinjutsu training and no special theoretical background. What he had was an artist's eye for structure and pattern, an ability to look at a complex diagram and immediately identify the point where the visual logic broke down, and a facility for inventing precise descriptive language for things that did not yet have names. He also had, it turned out, something he had never told anyone. He could see the cursed spirits, not with the completeness and clarity of the six eyes, not with the layered precision of the Sharingan, but the particular quality of Sai's perception, which had been shaped by an early life that had involved significant exposure to darkness in ways he did not discuss, meant that the very large cursed spirits registered in his awareness as a wrongness, a weight, a sense of space that was being occupied by something that should not have been there. He disclosed this to Issei on a Tuesday afternoon in the basement study room, in a voice that had the careful flatness of a person not sure what response to expect. Issei set down his brush. How long, he said. Since I can remember. Have you told anyone? No. Issei looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to a fresh page in the cipher notebook and began to draw the first diagram of what would become the perceptual classification system for cursed entities, a joint project between himself and Sai that would, over the following 2 years, produce the most complete taxonomy of cursed spirits ever assembled in the elemental nations. He did not make a larger event of it than that. He simply made space for what Sai could see in the framework they were building, and he did not ask about the early life that had produced the sensitivity. And Sai, in the specific way of a person who is being handled with intelligence rather than pressure, began to talk about it eventually on his own. Hinata joined the study group at the beginning of the 4th month, invited by no one in particular, and welcomed by everyone in the specific wordless way that happens when a group recognizes that it has been incomplete. She brought precise, meticulous notes from every lecture. She brought a Hyuga clan supplementary curriculum that covered chakra point theory at a level of depth the academy did not approach. She brought, most usefully, an attentive intelligence directed primarily at the human dimension of their work, asking questions about how things would function in practice, and whether their theoretical structures were robust enough to hold when the conditions were not ideal. Her questions made everything better. She also brought, after 2 weeks of watching Issei work with the boosted gear visible on his arm during late session practice runs, a question he had not expected. The gauntlet, she said one evening, when Karen and Sai had stepped out and the study room had the particular quality of a space that is temporarily just 2 people. It is not a standard chakra construct. No, he said. It is not. I can see it with the Byakugan. Not clearly. But it occupies a frequency that does not correspond to any chakra nature I have studied. The Tenketsu points near it respond differently than they should. He looked at her. He considered how much to explain and concluded that Hinata, who asked careful questions and received the answers with the same carefulness, and who had never used any information she had been given in a way that was anything other than thoughtful, had earned a direct answer. It is called the boosted gear, he said. It belongs to a metaphysical system that is different from chakra. It doubles my power every 10 seconds in combat. He paused. It also contains a dragon. Hinata absorbed this. A dragon, she said? His name is Draig. He is the Welsh Dragon Emperor. He has been sealed in the gear for a very long time. Draig, who was paying attention, said, "Hello?" The voice from the jewel was low and distinct in the quiet room. Hinata looked at the gear. She looked at Issei. She had the expression of someone performing a rapid internal recalibration. "Hello," she said, with the precise courtesy of a person from an old clan who has had it drilled into her that one is polite to anything with enough presence to address you directly. Draig made the sound that was probably a laugh. "I like her," the dragon said. "That is reassuring," Issei said. Hinata looked down at her notes, and the tips of her ears were very slightly red, and she said, "I have more questions about the frequency differential if that is all right." He answered her questions. She took careful notes. The cursed spirit in the ceiling of the eastern classroom moved slightly in its ancient, patient grievance, and the 4 children in the basement study room built something together that none of them had words for yet. Chapter 8. Something in the Shadows. The Grade 3 cursed spirit appeared in the forest at the northern edge of the village in the 7th month of the academy term. Issei knew it was there 3 days before it manifested strongly enough to cause problems, because the 6 eyes tracked the accumulation of cursed energy in that part of the forest with the same routine precision it tracked everything else. He watched the energy coalesce over those 3 days with the careful attention of a student observing an experiment in progress, noting the rate of accumulation, the signature characteristics of the forming entity, and the specific emotional source that was feeding it. The emotional source was the memorial stone. There had been a ceremony at the memorial stone 6 days earlier, a gathering of shinobi families on the anniversary of the Nine Tails attack. The grief concentrated there in the days following had been substantial, and a portion of it had, following the path of least resistance, drifted north along the forest edge where an old accumulation point sat in the shadow of a particular rock formation. The result was a Grade 3, coherent enough to have purpose, large enough to be a genuine risk to civilians who wandered too far from the village perimeter. He went to deal with it on a Saturday morning, telling no one except Draig, who voiced a measured objection. "You are 8 years old," the dragon said. "A Grade 3 is within my demonstrated containment capacity," Issei said. "I tested the large-scale resonance containment array 6 months ago. You tested it on a Grade 4. The theoretical scaling is sound. A Grade 3 simply requires a larger initial seal array and more precise anchoring." A pause. "If anything goes significantly wrong," Draig said, "I am going to boost us whether you ask me to or not." "That is acceptable," Issei said. "Though I would prefer not to need it." He found the spirit in the shadow of the rock formation at mid-morning. It was approximately twice his height, and composed of the specific compressed darkness of deeply accumulated grief. Not malevolent in any directed sense but charged with the indiscriminate destructive potential of a force that had stopped being a feeling and become something with weight and intention. It registered his presence, and oriented toward him. He had already placed the preliminary anchoring marks during his reconnaissance approach, 4 points in a 30-meter radius around the formation, each one a single character seal struck into tree bark and stone with a brush he had brought specifically for this purpose. He now stood at the center point and channeled chakra through the connecting lines he had prepared mentally, activating the resonance architecture he had been refining for 2 years. The seal array lit up in the dark red and black frequency of his mature resonance work. The cursed spirit turned toward the activation and registered, in whatever passed for perception in a non-sapient Grade 3, that the space it was standing in had changed. The resonance architecture created a field in which the binding logic was ambient rather than targeted. The spirit did not need to be subdued. It needed to be offered an agreement, and the agreement needed to be one that its nature could accept. the seal said, in the language of structured binding, that the grief it was made of could exist here, contained and stable, without the destructive expansion that made it dangerous. The Grade 3 resisted for approximately 40 seconds. Then, with the particular quality of something very large and very tired finding a boundary it could rest against, it contracted. The cursed energy condensed into the anchor point Issei had prepared at the center of the formation, a sealed stone that would hold the compression stable indefinitely unless physically broken. He crouched and examined the final seal. It was clean. The binding was stable. The Grade 3 was contained without being destroyed, which meant the grief it was made of had not been lost but simply given a form that could not cause harm. He was not entirely sure this was the right approach, philosophically. He thought about it on the walk back to the village. You are thinking about whether it is better to seal them or eliminate them, Drake observed. I am thinking about what they are, Issei said. They are made of human emotion. They are made of things that people felt. I am not sure what it means to destroy something like that. The dragon was quiet for a moment. You are 8 years old and thinking about the metaphysics of suffering, he said. I am aware of how that sounds. It sounds like you, Drake said. That is not a criticism. Issei walked back through the forest edge into the village, and the morning light came through the trees, and the Grade 3 in the rock formation sat quietly in its sealed stone and did not hurt anyone. Iruka-sensei asked him to stay after class on the following Monday. The classroom was empty except for the two of them, and the afternoon light was long and golden through the windows, and Iruka had the expression of a man who has been deciding how to have a conversation and has finally committed to a particular approach. There is a report, he said, from the patrol team that covers the North Forest perimeter, that a large cursed entity that has been registering on certain sensors near the memorial stone for the past several days appears to have been contained. Issei waited. The containment seal architecture, Iruka said carefully, is consistent with work in a notebook that I have had the opportunity to examine. Still waiting. Issei. A pause. You are 8 years old. People keep saying that, Issei said. Iruka looked at him for a long moment. His chakra signature had the quality of a person who is managing multiple competing responses to a situation, working through concern and something that resembled admiration and professional obligation and arriving somewhere that was attempting to be all three at once. The Hokage is going to want to speak with you, he said. Not as a concern. More of a... He paused. More of a very interested conversation. He asked me to come back when I had Series 2 ready, Issei said. I have most of Series 2 ready. Iruka stared at him. I will set up the meeting, Iruka said finally. Thank you, Issei said, and picked up his bag and left. Behind him, Iruka sat at his desk for a while and thought about the fact that he was an academy instructor for gifted children, and he had never quite accounted for the possibility that the word gifted had meaningful extremes. The Hokage meeting was on a Wednesday. Issei brought Series 2 of the Resonance Architecture Notebook, the perceptual classification system materials he had been developing with Sai, and a written summary of everything he had sealed in Konoha over the past 3 years. The list was 47 entries long. He placed it on the Hokage's desk and sat down, and waited while the old man read it. Hiruzen Sarutobi read it slowly and completely, and then set it down and looked at the boy across from him with the expression of a man who has long experience with unusual things and is still finding this one remarkable. 47, he said, since age 5. The earlier ones were smaller. The methodology improved significantly around year 2. The Hokage was quiet. You have been doing this alone, he said. My father knows. He does not have the perception to see them independently, but he has been informed. And no one in the active shinobi corps has any knowledge of these entities. No. They have no framework for perceiving them, and the damage they cause is diffuse enough to be attributed to other factors. Mood degradation, interpersonal conflict, the general heaviness that accumulates in places that have seen significant violence or loss. The Hokage picked up the classification system materials. He spent a long time on the page Sai had drafted that showed, in clean ink drawings rendered with an artist's precision, the visual representation of each grade. The boy who drew these, he said. He can see them too, with less clarity than I can. But yes. It is a form of perception that seems to be triggered by significant early exposure to concentrated negative emotion. I believe there may be others in the village who have it to varying degrees and have never had a framework for understanding what they are perceiving. The old man was quiet for a while. Issei, he said. What do you need to address this on a larger scale? Issei had prepared for this question. Legitimacy, he said. The ability to move through the village and operate at the perimeter without being stopped. A space to continue theoretical development. Eventually, access to historical records from Uzumaki archives, if any exist in Konoha's restricted collection, because the Uzumaki appear to have been developing towards similar seal theory from a different direction and the convergence may be significant. The Hokage looked at him over his folded hands. You are 8, he said. I have heard this observation before, Issei said. I find that it does not change the situation. Hiruzen Sarutobi, who had been Hokage for a very long time and had encountered many difficult situations, sat with that for a moment. Then, with the decision of a man who has learned that the correct response to an extraordinary situation is to respond to it as it is rather than as he expected it to be, he reached for his brush and his official seal. Chapter 9. What cannot be taught? The special ordinance the Hokage issued was a quiet one. It did not appear in any public announcement. It appeared in the administrative records as a supplementary designation that allowed a named academy student to access certain restricted sections of the village archives and move at the village perimeter without requiring adult supervision, contingent on weekly check-in with the Hokage's office. Fugaku, when he received a private briefing on this, was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You have been briefing the Hokage on our compound for 3 years. On the spiritual atmosphere of the compound, Issei said, which I have been addressing. The reports were to provide accountability and context, not surveillance. His father was quiet again. The Hokage, Fugaku said, issued an official designation for an 8-year-old academy student. Technically I am 8.5. Fugaku rubbed his face. This was becoming a more common gesture. He was, however, proud. Issei could read it clearly in the chakra signature, and the careful suppression of the expression that would have shown it too openly. Fugaku was a man who experienced pride with significant intensity and expressed it with significant restraint, and the gap between those two things was sometimes visible if you knew where to look. Do not do anything that requires the Hokage to revise his confidence in you, Fugaku said. I will try, Issei said. His father looked at him. You will not try. You will do it. Trying is what people say when they are not committed. A pause. I will do it, Issei said. The corner of Fugaku's mouth moved in a way that was technically not a smile. The archive access was more useful than he had expected, which was saying something because he had expected it to be very useful. The restricted archive held 3 boxes of Uzumaki records recovered from Whirlpool's ruins in the years after the destruction, catalogued as damaged and incomplete and insufficiently understood for active use. They were damaged and incomplete. But they were not insufficiently understood, not anymore, because Karen had spent 2 years reconstructing the theoretical foundation and Issei had spent 2 years building a parallel framework from different materials, and the two of them together could read most of what the archive catalogers had written off as illegible. He brought Karen to the archive on a Saturday. She stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 boxes of recovered Uzumaki materials and went very still. He gave her a moment. When she finally moved, it was slowly, the way you approach something fragile. And when she opened the first box and saw the scrolls inside, she did not make a sound for a long time. These are original, she said finally. Whirlpool originals. I have only ever seen copies of copies. They were recovered by a retrieval team in the 3rd year after the destruction. No one has been able to read most of them. She looked at him. Her eyes were very bright behind the glasses. We can read them. We can read most of them. Some of the notation is still unclear. But the theoretical framework is consistent with what we have been building. She picked up the first scroll with both hands, with the extreme care of someone holding something irreplaceable, and began to read. He sat beside her and they worked through the morning and into the afternoon, translating the archaic notation into the combined framework they had built, and what emerged from the Uzumaki records was something that neither of them had independently anticipated. The ancient Uzumaki had not simply been working on resonance architecture. They had been working towards something they called the living seal, a binding structure that did not simply contain its subject but established a genuine two-way relationship with it, A seal that grew and adapted over time rather than degrading, that could accept modification from both sides of the binding. A seal that was, in its fundamental architecture, a partnership rather than a cage. Karen set down the scroll and looked at Issei. This is what the boosted gear is, she said. He looked at the scroll. He looked at her. He felt the gear pulse once against his wrist in the rhythm he had come to identify as Drake paying close attention. Yes, he said. I think it is. Karen picked up her pen and began writing so fast that the strokes were barely legible, and Issei opened the cipher notebook to a fresh page, and they worked until the archive closed, and the archivist came to turn them out into the evening air. Walking home, he turned the idea over carefully in his mind. The living seal. A structure that adapted. That accepted input from what it contained. He thought about Drake, who had been in the boosted gear for centuries before finding him, and what the dragon had said on their first day, "You are not who I was expecting." He thought about what it would mean to build something like that. Not just to contain cursed spirits but to work with them. Not just to seal power but to enter into genuine negotiation with it. The night air of Konoha smelled like pine and wood smoke and the particular clean mineral quality of mountain water, and somewhere in the village the memorial stone held its grief in the quiet dark, and he walked home through streets that were almost entirely free of cursed energy for the first time in years. Sai presented the first completed perceptual classification system document at the end of the academic year. He presented it in the basement study room, to the four of them, on a large sheet of paper that he had clearly spent considerable time on, the illustrations precise and clean and rendered in the particular ink style that was already identifiably Sai's, each entity shown in multiple orientations with notation indicating the observable characteristics at each grade level. It was beautiful, in the specific way that a very clear piece of work about a dark subject can be beautiful. Issei looked at it for a long time. This is the best piece of analytical documentation I have ever seen someone produce, he said. Sai absorbed this. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted, the way a room shifts when a window is opened. It is accurate, he said. Completely. The grade distinctions are exactly right. The behavioral markers in columns 3 and 4 are things I have observed but never been able to articulate this precisely. He pointed to the grade 2 illustration. This. The way you have captured the quality of the wrongness it projects. That is exactly it. Karen was already pulling the document toward her to examine the notation. Hinata was looking at the grade 5 diagram with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing it against her Byakugan perception memory. I can see the very large ones, Hinata said. Not clearly. But this. She pointed to the grade 2 illustration. This is what it looks like when I look at them through the Byakugan. I never knew what it was. Sai looked at her. Then he looked at Issei. There are others who can perceive them, Sai said. Not a question. There may be more than we think, Issei said. People who have been perceiving them their entire lives and have no framework for what they are seeing. He looked at the classification system document. This is the beginning of the framework. The four of them sat with that for a moment, in the study room with the chalk smell and the afternoon light coming in narrow through the high window, and the thing they were building together felt, for the first time, like something large enough to matter beyond the four of them. Chapter 10. The Measure of a Year. At the end of the Academy's second year, the instructors held an assessment that was designed to evaluate combat readiness, theoretical knowledge, and field application. It was the first assessment where students were expected to demonstrate practical application of techniques rather than theoretical understanding, and the results were used to sort the graduating cohort into preliminary team groupings. It was also, by long-standing Uchiha tradition, the occasion when the clan's elders paid attention. Issei was aware of this. He had been aware of it for months, not because it caused him anxiety but because it required calibration. The question of how much to demonstrate was always a calibration question for him, because the gap between what he could do and what was legible as belonging to an academy student his age was already significant and growing. He discussed it with Fugaku the evening before the assessment. His father considered the question with the strategic thoroughness he brought to everything. The clan elders, Fugaku said, need to see enough to have confidence in the Uchiha name. The village instructors need to see enough to form a realistic picture for team placement. The Hokage already has a full picture. And the other students? His father looked at him. What about the other students? They are people I am going to spend years in the field with. The team I am placed with will be people I am responsible for, and who will be responsible for me. If there is a significant gap between what I show in the assessment and what I can actually do, that creates a problem for them. Fugaku was quiet for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted, not much, but enough. Show what is true, he said. At the level appropriate to this stage. You do not need to reveal everything. But do not perform below your actual level for the sake of politics. That is a habit that becomes permanent if you let it. Issei nodded. Your grandfather, Fugaku added, is going to say something about the assessment. I am telling you now so you are prepared. What will he say? Something about honor, and the clan's eyes watching. He says it at every assessment. A pause. Is it sincere? Yes, Fugaku said. That is what makes it complicated. The assessment was held on a clear autumn morning in the Academy's largest training ground, the one with the painted target posts and the observation platform where the instructors and visiting clan representatives sat. Issei went through the standard combat portion with clean, economical taijutsu that demonstrated the dragon slayer form his father had been teaching him, a style adapted from the basic shinobi taijutsu framework with modifications that Fugaku had developed over years of field experience, and that Issei had been quietly further modifying to accommodate the specific principles of the boosted gear's power curve. The form was not flashy. It was precise and principled and faster than expected for his size, and it ended each engagement in the minimum number of movements. He did not use the Sharingan. He did not activate the boosted gear. He watched the instructors take notes, and the clan representatives on the observation platform follow the proceedings and arrived at the conclusion that this was sufficient for the day's purposes. The theoretical portion he completed in 40 minutes out of the allotted 90, checked his work twice, and spent the remaining time reviewing the Uzumaki archive transcriptions he had brought in his bag. The practical application portion was seals. The prompt was to design and execute a containment seal suitable for field use. Standard parameters. The seal should be producible in under 3 minutes, stable for at least 6 hours, and capable of containing a target of moderate chakra output. He considered the standard solution and discarded it. Then he considered the calibration question again and arrived at a conclusion. He produced a 3-ring resonance containment seal in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He executed it completely. He activated it and demonstrated its stability on the test target, which was a chakra-releasing mechanism designed to simulate a confined entity attempting to break out. The seal held without degradation under full test load. He stepped back. He looked at the instructors. Iruka was writing something in his assessment book with the expression of a man who had expected this, and was still somehow surprised by it. On the observation platform, one of the clan elders leaned over to say something to another. On the other side of the platform, the representative from the Hokage's office made a small notation. Issei collected his materials and went to wait at the edge of the training ground. Sai came to stand beside him after completing his own assessment portion. He stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then he said, "The seal you just executed. That is the 3-ring resonance structure." "Yes. In under 3 minutes. 2:40. Sai looked at the training ground. "I am going to need to work harder," he said. "You are extraordinary at classification and documentation," Issei said. "Different things are hard for different people in different ways." That sounds like something someone says to be kind. It sounds like that because people usually say it when they are being kind. In this case it is also true. Sai considered this. "All right," he said. Karen finished the assessment, and came to stand on the other side of Issei. She had a small satisfied expression that she was not entirely suppressing. "My Uzumaki adaptation of the standard containment form held under double test load," she said. "I would like that noted." "Noted," Issei said. "Thank you." Hinata arrived last, having spent her allotted time on the practical application portion with the careful thoroughness she brought to everything. She stood beside Karen and looked at the training ground and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "I think I would like for us to be on the same team." The statement landed in the group with the quality of something that had been true for a while, and had simply been waiting for someone to say it. Issei looked at the 3 of them. He thought about his mother sitting on the garden wall in the dusk, telling him not to forget to let people in while he was building. He thought about the cursed spirits that had been gradually, carefully, systematically addressed across 2 years of quiet work, the compound cleaner and lighter for it, the people in it carrying less weight they could not name. He thought about the grade 3 in its sealed stone in the North Forest, grief given a form that could not cause harm. He thought about the living seal in the Uzumaki records, the partnership that adapted over time. He thought about all of it, and then he looked at his 3 friends standing in the autumn light of the academy training ground, and he felt something that was not catalogable, and did not need to be. I think so too, he said. Above the training ground, the sky was the deep particular blue of a Konoha autumn, and somewhere in the village the cursed energy ran quieter than it had in years, and the 4 of them stood together and waited for whatever came next. Act 3. The Long Road Between 2 Fires. Chapter 11. Graduation and the Geometry of Teams. The graduation ceremony was held on a morning in late spring when the cherry blossoms had already finished and the trees were dense with new green, and the air over Konoha had the particular quality that came after a long winter finally releasing its hold, warm and slightly electric, the kind of morning that made the village feel as though it had exhaled. Issei stood in the line of graduating students and catalogued the ceremony with the automatic precision of long habit. 32 graduates. The instructors at the front table, Iruka among them, each with a stack of headbands and the composed expressions of people performing a ritual they found genuinely meaningful. The families on the observation benches, his father and mother in the 3rd row from the front, Fugaku carrying himself with the careful restraint of a man who was proud and did not consider public demonstrations of pride appropriate. Mikoto with no such restraint, her expression openly warm and her hands folded in her lap with the deliberate patience of someone who would very much like to applaud and is exercising significant willpower. He catalogued the cursed energy in the ceremony grounds as well, because this was also habit. It was low today, distributed evenly across the space in the thin, ambient way of places where people were feeling mostly positive emotions. Ceremonies like this generated a specific quality of emotion that was neither the clean brightness of uncomplicated joy nor the heavy darkness of grief, but something layered and complex, the particular feeling of a door closing and another opening, and the specific parental emotion that had no name but that the 6 eyes identified as the intersection of pride and fear and love in proportions that varied with the family. He found Sai's absence of family in the benches. He found the empty space where Sai sat without anyone behind him, and he noted it, and he did not make it visible that he had noted it, because Sai did not want it visible, and respecting what people did not want visible was a different skill from the perception itself, and one he had worked at deliberately. Karen's family section held a distant cousin who had come because obligation required it, and who had the specific quality of chakra that indicated resentment being suppressed into the shape of duty. Karen sat in the student line with her chin up and her expression entirely neutral and her hands in her lap, and she did not look at the cousin, and the distance between those 2 facts was something Issei thought about for a moment, and then filed away carefully. Hinata's section was full. The Hyuga clan had sent 8 representatives to watch the eldest daughter of the main branch graduate, and they sat with the formal precision of people for whom public appearances were a form of communication. Her father Hayashi was in the center, his face carrying the specific expression of a man who found public emotional displays beneath the dignity of his position and was applying this principle with some difficulty to a situation that kept producing feelings he had to suppress. Her younger sister Hanabi was at the end of the row, too young to hide her excitement, looking at Hinata with open adoration. Hinata, called to the front when her name was read, walked with the careful deliberate posture that she had been working on since the balance exercise in their first academy week, and when she accepted her headband her hands were steady and her expression was calm, and only someone paying very close attention would have noticed the almost imperceptible brightness in her eyes that meant she was happy. Issei was paying very close attention. His own name was called last, which was the instructor's choice and which he understood to carry a significance he chose not to examine too carefully in the moment. He walked to the front. Iruka-sensei tied the headband with the steady hands of a man who was keeping his expression professional through what Issei read as genuine feeling, the specific quality of an instructor watching a student graduate who had cost him more sleep than all the others combined, but not in the way that caused sleep was usually meant. Good luck, Irika said quietly, as the knot was secured. Thank you, Issei said. For everything, sensei. Irika's chakra did something that Issei classified as the sensation of a person being briefly, entirely moved. Then Irika stepped back into his professional composure, and Issei walked back to his place in the line, and the ceremony continued. The team assignments were posted on a board outside the main classroom 3 days after graduation, and Issei stood in front of the board for exactly as long as it took to read the relevant line before stepping back to allow others room. Team 7, Uzumaki Karen. Uchiha Issei. And a third name he had known would be on any team assigned to him because the Hokage had a particular sense of how to arrange things, and that sense had always accounted for what certain individuals needed rather than simply what they were capable of. Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto had been a fixture of Issei's academy years in the way that a very loud, very bright thing is a fixture of any environment it occupies. He was impossible to miss and almost impossible to fully catalog because the energy he put out was so consistently and comprehensively forward-facing that the 6 eyes had difficulty getting a stable read on the layers underneath. Bright chakra, enormous reserves for his age, the specific quality that Issei had come to identify as the presence of a significant sealed entity, and underneath all of it, underneath the noise and the broad grins and the absolute refusal to acknowledge when things were going badly, a loneliness so deeply foundational that it had become structural rather than active. The way a building's foundations are not the building but are what the building is made possible by. Issei had been watching Naruto for 3 years with the interest he brought to unusual things, and Naruto had returned this attention with the specific aggressive friendliness of a person who has been told by every available signal that he is unwanted and has decided to act as though he has not heard. He was, Issei had concluded after 3 years of careful observation, one of the most genuinely remarkable people he had ever encountered in either of his lives. He was also profoundly annoying in approximately 17 distinct ways, most of which were a direct consequence of the foundational loneliness expressing itself as performance, and all of which Issei had categorized and made peace with. Karen read the board. She looked at Naruto's name. She looked at Issei. Him, she said? Yes. He is very loud. He is. Issei turned from the board. He is also exceptionally talented, genuinely resilient in ways that most people are not, and capable of a quality of connection with other people that is genuinely rare. The noise is a surface feature. Karen was quiet for a moment, looking at Naruto across the courtyard, where he was currently doing something energetic and inadvisable with a training post. How long have you been watching people that carefully, she said. Since birth, Issei said. More or less. She looked at him. Sometimes, she said, you say something that reminds me how genuinely unusual you are, and then I have to recalibrate. I appreciate the honesty. Someone has to provide it, she said, and went to review the rest of the board. Their Jonin sensei was Uzumaki Rei. She arrived for the first team meeting 20 minutes early, which Issei noted as unusual, and she stood in the training ground with the particular stillness of someone who was watching an area before entering it, not from paranoia but from long habit. She was perhaps 30, with hair the red of old wine rather than the bright orange of the Uzumaki stereotype, and she carried herself with the economy of someone who had been in the field long enough to have stopped performing competence, and simply embodied it. She looked at the 3 of them assembling. Her eyes moved across Karen, assessed, moved to Naruto, did something complex, moved to Issei and stopped. The stop was brief. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. But it was the specific stop of someone encountering a piece of information they were not expecting. Issei Uchiha, she said. Uzumaki-sensei, he said. Something moved in her expression. Not quite recognition, not quite surprise. Something between the two. You know who I am, she said. Not a question. I know your seal work, he said. The 7-ring compression architecture published in the Konoha Fuinjutsu Society's quarterly review 4 years ago. The series on adaptive binding structures, and the unpublished work on resonance-based chakra flow regulation, which I read in the archive's restricted section. A pause. That section requires Hokage-level authorization, she said. Yes, Issei said. Rei looked at him for another moment. Then, with the expression of a person arriving at a conclusion she had apparently been building towards since before the meeting started. She said, "I see." She moved to the center of the training ground and looked at all three of them with the direct, unambiguous attention of a teacher who has decided to take her students seriously. "Before we begin," she said, "I need to understand what you are each working with. Not what the Academy files say. What is actually true. You will each tell me one thing about your abilities that your Academy file does not capture." She paused. "Honestly. If you tell me something the file already covers, I will know." Naruto went first. He was direct about it, in the specific way of someone who has nothing to hide because he has already been conspicuous his entire life. He told her about the Nine Tails chakra, the way it leaked through in extreme situations, the way it felt like something enormous pressing against a membrane that was thinner than it should have been. He said it flatly, without apology, watching Rei's face for the reaction. She received it without flinching. Karen told her about the Uzumaki archive work, and the living seal theory, and the collaboration she had been conducting with Issei for 2 years. She was precise and somewhat formal about it, the formality of someone who has learned to present unusual capabilities in terms that make them legible as assets rather than anomalies. Rei listened with complete attention. Then she looked at Issei. He considered what to say. He thought about what was true and what was appropriate to this moment, and what Rei's 7-ring compression architecture suggested about how she thought about binding problems, and he said, "I can see cursed spirits. I have been sealing them in the village for 3 years. I have a secondary power system from a different metaphysical framework that doubles my combat ability at 10-second intervals and is inhabited by a dragon. I have 2 tomo in each eye. And I have been developing a domain-class seal architecture that I call the Infinite Boost Domain, which is currently in theoretical refinement." He paused. "The Academy file covers the Sharingan and some of the Fuinjutsu work. It does not cover the rest." The training ground was quiet for a moment. Naruto was staring at him. This was not unusual. Naruto stared at many things. But the specific quality of this stare had awe in it, which was a different register than his usual. "Cursed what?" Naruto said. Rei had not moved. She was looking at Issei with the expression of someone who has been briefed on a situation and is finding that the briefing was insufficient in multiple directions. "The Hokage told me you were unusual," she said finally. I think the word unusual was doing significant work in that sentence. "He tends toward understatement," Issei said. Rei looked at all 3 of them again. Then she made the specific decision that Issei's 6 eyes identified as a person choosing to lead rather than manage, the difference being that leading required meeting people where they actually were rather than where the structure expected them to be. "All right," she said. "Show me everything. We have all afternoon and I want to actually understand what I am working with." They showed her. It took 4 hours, and at the end of it the sun was low and the training ground was covered in seal marks, and Naruto had demonstrated 3 different kinds of shadow clone, and Rei had asked 43 questions that Issei counted because he could not stop, and each one was better than the last. Walking home in the long evening light, Karen fell into step beside him. "She is good," Karen said. "Yes," Issei said. "She is." She knew about the Uzumaki living seal theory. She did not know all of it. But she recognized the structural principles when I described them. Karen was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that she has been working on something similar. Independently. From the published resonance work." Issei thought about the 7-ring compression architecture, which was not simply an advanced containment tool but was, if you looked at it from the right theoretical angle, the structural foundation of a much larger system that its author had not yet published the rest of. "Yes," he said. "I think you are right." They walked the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of 2 people who are thinking about the same thing, and do not need to say so. Chapter 12. What Grows in the Dark. The first month of Team 7's training under Rei was the most demanding thing Issei had experienced since he had begun the practical application of his seal work, and he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely extended by it. Not by the combat training, which pushed Naruto and tested Karen, but which Issei moved through with the combined advantage of the Sharingan's predictive processing, the Dragon Slayer taijutsu form, and 3 years of supplementary training under his father. And not by the theoretical work, which Rei assigned with the ambitious scope of someone who had spent years wishing she had students who could handle it. What extended him was the teamwork. He was not, he had to acknowledge, a natural team member. He had grown up operating independently, building systems that required no coordination with others, making decisions based on his own perception and his own analysis and his own judgment. The habit of independence was so deeply ingrained that he had not fully noticed it until Rei began designing exercises specifically to expose and correct it. She did this with the precision of someone who had identified the problem accurately and was addressing it directly. The exercise she called information disparity was the one he found most challenging. In its basic form, it gave each team member a different piece of critical information and required them to synthesize it in the field without time to compare notes, thoroughly. For most teams, this tested communication under pressure. For Issei, it tested something more specific, whether he trusted his teammates enough to act on their information when he could not verify it himself. He did not, initially, trust his teammates enough to do that. This was not because he thought them unreliable. He trusted Karen's theoretical judgment completely, and Naruto's field instincts more than he had expected to. The problem was more fundamental. He was accustomed to having complete information, and operating without it produced in him a specific discomfort that was not quite anxiety, but was close enough to it to be disruptive. Rei watched him work through this over 3 weeks of graduated exercises, and then, on a Tuesday afternoon when Karen and Naruto had stepped away, she sat beside him on the training ground fence and said, "You catalog everything." "Yes," he said, as a way of feeling safe. He looked at her. This was, he recognized, the kind of observation that was true enough to be uncomfortable. "As a way of being effective," he said. "Those are not the same thing," she said. "And I think you know that." He was quiet for a moment. "The 6 eyes," he said. "When I was born, I could not turn it off. Everything was incoming simultaneously. The cataloging was how I organized it into something I could exist inside of." Rei listened. "At some point," he said slowly, "the cataloging became the thing itself, rather than the tool for managing the thing. I know this. I have known it for a while." He looked at the training ground. "Trusting partial information means accepting that my picture of a situation is incomplete. Accepting that means accepting that I might make a wrong decision based on what I do not know." "Yes," Rei said. "That is what it means." A pause. "How do you manage it?" he said. "Being in the field. Making decisions with incomplete information all the time." She looked at the training ground. She had the expression of a teacher deciding how honest to be about the thing she is teaching, which is always a slightly different question from how honest to be about the subject matter. "You trust the people beside you," she said. "Not because they are infallible. Because you have watched them work long enough to know the shape of their judgment, and you have decided that their shape is compatible with yours." She paused. "It is not the same as certainty. But it is enough to move forward." He thought about Karen asking precise questions. About Sai's clean ink classifications. About Hinata's careful notes. About Naruto charging into situations with the absolute conviction of someone who has never once considered the possibility of simply walking away. He thought about the shape of their judgment. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. The exercise the following day, he acted on Karen's information without verifying it. She was correct. She had been correct about the structural fault in the seal array from the beginning, and if he had acted on it immediately instead of taking 30 seconds to double-check with his own perception, they would have contained the training scenario's simulated threat 40 seconds sooner. 40 seconds in field conditions was not nothing. He added this to the catalog, but not as data this time. As something to practice. Naruto learned about the cursed spirits on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week of training. It happened because Naruto, who had a very direct relationship with reality and found circumlocution exhausting, simply asked. They had been running perimeter exercises along the northern forest edge, the same area where Issei had sealed the grade 3 2 years earlier. Naruto had stopped at the sealed rock formation with the particular arrested quality of a person who has felt something without being able to identify it. "What is that?" he said. Not to anyone in particular. Just to the air. Rei glanced at Issei. "A sealed cursed spirit," Issei said. "Grade 3. I contained it approximately 2 years ago." The seal is still holding. Naruto turned and looked at him with all the focused attention he had, which was considerable. You did that, he said. Yes. When you were 8. Yes. Naruto looked at the sealed stone. He looked at Issei. He had the expression of someone who is reconfiguring their understanding of a person they thought they already understood. And you can see them, he said. All the time. Yes. In the village. There are currently 14 active cursed spirit entities within Konoha's walls, ranging from grade 5 to grade 4. 3 of them are in areas I have not yet had access to address. The rest are smaller than they were 3 years ago. Naruto sat down on the ground, which was characteristic of the way he processed significant information. Karen sat on a training log nearby. She had heard all of this before, but she watched Naruto's processing with the attention of someone who found other people's reactions to Issei's revelations reliably informative about where their own blind spots had been. Does it? Naruto started. He stopped. He started again. Does it bother you? Seeing them all the time. Issei thought about this honestly. In the beginning, everything bothered me, he said. The 6 eyes deliver a complete picture of whatever I am looking at, and a complete picture of a world is very loud. The cursed spirits were part of the noise. He paused. Now they are part of the landscape. I notice them the way you notice shadows. They are there, and some of them require addressing, and the rest are simply present. Naruto looked at him for a moment. That is, he said, both really cool and kind of sad. This was, Issei reflected, possibly the most accurate 2-word summary of his perceptual experience that anyone had ever produced without extensive briefing. Yes, he said. More or less. Naruto was quiet for a moment, looking at the sealed stone. The Kyuubi's chakra, which Issei could read clearly through the seal that contained it, had a different quality in this moment. Less the contained pressure of banked power and more the specific register of something very large paying close, careful attention. The fox, Naruto said quietly. It can feel that thing in the rock. I know, Issei said. Can it feel all of them? The ones in the village? I believe so. The 9 Tails is a being of enormous chakra that was born from the accumulated emotional energy of humanity. Its relationship to cursed energy, which is generated by the same source, is likely very direct. It probably has a clearer perception of cursed spirits than it has ever been able to communicate. Naruto was quiet for a long time after that. Rei, who had been listening without intervening, said nothing. She looked at Issei with the expression she had worn increasingly over the past weeks, the expression of someone watching a thing develop and choosing not to interfere with the development. Eventually Naruto stood up and said, Okay. Show me what we are dealing with. So Issei explained the classification system, and Karen pulled her copy of the documentation from her bag, and Naruto sat cross-legged on the forest floor and read every page with the focused attention of someone who has decided to understand something completely. And the afternoon light came through the trees and the sealed grade 3 sat quietly in its stone and Team 7 became, in that moment, something more complete than the sum of its filed descriptions. The cursed spirit in the Academy's eastern classroom had been growing. Issei had noted this over the course of the year, tracking its expansion with the regular precision of monitoring. What had been a grade 5 smear of residual emotion when he first arrived was now a solid grade 4, coherent enough to have consistent behavioral patterns, large enough to be generating a measurable effect on the people in its immediate environment. The eastern classroom had a higher rate of interpersonal conflict than the other classrooms. The instructors who taught there most frequently reported a subtle, persistent low-grade irritability that they attributed to the ancient ventilation system and the afternoon sun angle. Students who sat in the classroom for extended periods found themselves on edge in ways they could not name. He could not address it from outside the classroom, the entity having taken up a position between the ceiling joists that required interior access to reach with the seal array. He had been waiting for a natural opportunity. The natural opportunity arrived when Iruka-sensei asked him to help set up the end-of-term examination room and gave him an hour alone in the eastern classroom with the explanation that the supply cabinet was in the far corner. He set up the supply cabinet materials. He also placed 5 anchor marks in the ceiling joists through the ventilation access panel, 3 marks on the far wall at the specific heights required by the containment geometry, and the central binding seal beneath the loose board third from the window that he had noted as structurally accessible on his first day. The Grade 4, when the resonance architecture activated, made the conceptual protest he had come to recognize as the sound of something large being given a boundary it had not expected. The binding took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He replaced the ventilation panel. He collected the supply cabinet materials. He left the classroom. The following week, the instructors who taught in the Eastern classroom noted, without being able to explain why, that the room had a different quality to it. Lighter. Less like a space that had been holding its breath. They attributed it to the spring cleaning that had happened concurrently, which was reasonable. He let them. Chapter 13. Mike Guy and the Geometry of Effort. Mike Guy arrived at their training ground on a Wednesday in the team's second month, which was not an accident. He arrived the way he arrived everywhere, with the kinetic intensity of someone whose relationship with stillness was more of an ongoing negotiation than an achieved state, and he stood in the center of the training ground looking at Team 7 with the bright, complete attention of a man who looked at everything that way and meant it entirely. Ray had invited him. She had mentioned this to Issei the previous day with the specific tone of someone who is calibrating your expectations. Guy-sensei has a particular method, she had said. He is also possibly the most genuinely knowledgeable person I know on the subject of taijutsu mechanics at a fundamental level. What he calls the power of youth is not simply enthusiasm. It is a worked-out theory of how human physical potential develops, and it is correct in ways that most people who dismiss it fail to understand. I know his work, Issei had said. The 8 inner gates system. The relationship between physical conditioning and chakra flow efficiency. The theory of dynamic tension as a catalyst for ceiling breaking in physical ability. Ray had looked at him. Of course you do, she said. Now Mike Guy stood in the training ground and looked at Issei with the expression of a man who has been briefed and is finding the briefing insufficient. Ray-kun tells me you have been developing a taijutsu system of your own, he said. A derivative system, Issei said. Based on my father's Dragon Slayer form, with modifications for the specific dynamics of the boosted gear's power curve. Guy's expression did something complicated. Show me, he said. They sparred. Guy moved the way exceptional physical practitioners moved, not quickly in the crude sense of fast but still comprehensible, but with the specific quality of someone who had spent decades making their body understand principles rather than patterns, who could generate the correct movement for any situation without having to remember it because the understanding was physical rather than mnemonic. The Sharingan tracked him perfectly. The Dragon Slayer form, which was built on principles rather than patterns for the same reason, held its own in the geometry of the exchange. They went for 6 minutes. Guy was pushing at perhaps 40% of his actual capacity. Issei was at 60. And at the end of it they were both standing in the center of the training ground and Guy was looking at him with an expression that had completely abandoned whatever he had walked in with. The form, Guy said. His voice was different from how it had been at the start, carrying the specific quality of a practitioner encountering something that required serious engagement. It is built on the principle of dynamic body-weapon integration. Your body and the gear are not separate systems. You have been training them as a unified kinetic architecture. Yes, Issei said. Who taught you that principle? No one. I derived it from first principles when I was 5. Guy looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down cross-legged in the middle of the training ground, which was not a thing Issei had ever seen him do, and said, Sit down. I want to talk about dynamic integration theory. Specifically, I want to tell you where your form has gaps and why filling them requires understanding the 8 gates at a theoretical level before you are anywhere near ready to attempt them practically. Issei sat down. They talked for 2 hours. Guy was not what people who only saw the surface of him expected, which was a lesson about perception that Issei filed away. Underneath the performance of boundless enthusiasm was one of the most rigorous physical theorists he had encountered, a man who had spent his entire career thinking hard about how the body worked, and what it was capable of, and who could discuss the relationship between physical conditioning and chakra flow efficiency with the same depth and precision that Karen brought to seal theory. He also had, it turned out, things to say about the boosted gear's power doubling mechanic that no one else had thought to consider. The doubling interval is 10 seconds, Guy said. Which means the power curve is exponential. Which means that in a sustained engagement, you are not fighting the same opponent you started against. You are fighting a progressively weaker version of any fixed output opponent, while becoming progressively stronger yourself. He paused. The implication of this, tactically, is that you want engagements to last. Not to end them quickly. Most taijutsu philosophy is about ending fights efficiently. Yours needs to be about sustaining them at acceptable cost long enough for the exponential advantage to become decisive. Issei looked at him. He had known this, in the abstract way of someone who understood the boosted gear's mechanics. He had not articulated it in those specific terms, and the articulation changed the shape of the implications significantly. The Dragon Slayer form, he said slowly, needs a defensive tier. A sustained pressure mode that minimizes incoming damage while the boost compounds. Yes, said Guy. Exactly that. He stood. Come back on Friday. I want to work with you on the foundation of that tier. Not the techniques. The principles underneath them. Once the principles are right, the techniques will follow. He left with the same kinetic intensity with which he had arrived. Naruto, who had watched the entire exchange from the training ground fence, said. He sat down. Yes, Issei said. Guy-sensei does not sit down. He sat down. Naruto processed this. You must have said something really interesting, he said. The Friday sessions became a standing arrangement. Guy came every Friday to the training ground that Ray had designated as Team 7's primary development space, and he and Issei worked on the structural foundation of what Guy had named, with characteristic directness, the sustained dragon form. The name was Guy's, not Issei's, but it was accurate enough that he did not object. The sustained dragon form was built on 4 principles that Guy laid out in the first session, and which Issei spent the following weeks working into his physical practice at the level below conscious technique. The first principle was contact minimization, the ability to be present in a fight, exerting pressure and creating opportunities, while receiving as little force as possible in return. The second principle was interval awareness, the ability to track the boosted gear's 10-second compounding cycle in the back of his awareness without it occupying primary attention. The third principle was opponent fixation, which did not mean staring at the opponent, but meant maintaining the quality of attention that the Sharingan's predictive processing required, the specific engaged awareness that was not aggression but was its close relative. The fourth principle was what Guy called the release threshold, the moment in the exponential curve where the advantage had compounded to the point where the contained power could be released without risk of overextension. These principles were not techniques. They were the architecture that techniques lived inside. Learning them was different from learning techniques, slower and less immediately gratifying, because the changes happened at a level that was not visible until it was, and then it was dramatically visible. The moment it became visible was in the 5th week, during a sparring session with Ray that she had designed as an honest test. She was operating at a level that would genuinely challenge him rather than a calibrated percentage of her capacity. He lasted 11 minutes before she caught him. But in those 11 minutes, he had boosted 8 full cycles. Ray stopped. She looked at him with an expression that had something new in it. The last 30 seconds, she said. You were faster than I expected. Significantly faster. 8 cycles, he said. At 10-second intervals, doubling each time. She did the arithmetic. The arithmetic was significant. 11 minutes, she said. If you can reliably reach 11 minutes of sustained engagement, under those conditions before the release threshold. I need to work on the contact minimization tier, he said. The 4th and 5th cycles are where I am taking too much damage. If I can reduce the incoming cost there, I can reliably reach 12 or 13 minutes. Ray was quiet for a moment. I need you to understand something, she said. What you just described, if you can execute it consistently, is not a strong technique. It is a strategic level ability. It means that in any sustained engagement, given enough time to cycle, you will be operating at a level that most opponents cannot prepare for because most opponents do not have access to exponential scaling. I know, he said. It comes with a corresponding responsibility, she said. Not just tactically. In terms of when and whether to use it. He thought about the grade 3 in the sealed stone. About the 47 cursed spirits he had addressed over 3 years, none of them destroyed, all of them bound in agreements rather than eliminated. About the choice that every application of power required, which was not just can I but should I, and in what way. I know that too, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Good, she said. Let's go again. Karen's Uzumaki restoration work reached a significant threshold in the third month of Team 7's formation. She had been working on a specific scroll from the archive, the most damaged of the Whirlpool originals, a document that the archivist's catalog described as partially legible, content unclear, possibly ritual in nature. The description was accurate in the sense that the first 2/3 of the scroll were in a notation system archaic enough to require the combined framework she and Issei had built over 2 years to translate. The ritual characterization had been understandable given that the archivist had been able to read enough to recognize a ceremonial structure without being able to read enough to understand what the ceremony was doing. What the ceremony was doing, as it turned out, was initializing a living seal. Not a theoretical discussion of the living seal principle. Not a partial description. A complete initialization protocol, with every step documented in the kind of granular, fault-tolerant detail that suggested the original author had known that this document might need to be used by someone with incomplete context. Karen brought it to the team's study session on a Thursday evening, and she set it on the table, and she said, with the careful, deliberate voice of someone who has been containing significant news and is now releasing it in a controlled manner, I know how to do it. Issei looked at the scroll. He read the initialization protocol. He read it a second time, more slowly, checking his translation at 3 points where the notation was complex. The protocol was complete and coherent, and it was, as Karen had said, everything they needed. A living seal, Naruto said. He had been spending enough time with the Uzumaki archive materials to follow most of the theoretical discussions now. The kind that establishes a partnership rather than a cage. Yes, Karen said. What would you use it on, he said. This was the question Issei had been sitting with since he read the protocol. He looked at the scroll. He looked at the theory they had built. He looked at the boosted gear on his wrist, where Drake had been paying close attention since Karen began speaking. Not on anything, he said slowly. Not right now. The protocol requires both parties to be fully informed and to enter the agreement voluntarily. It is not a tool you deploy. It is a relationship you establish. He looked at Karen. Keep the scroll secure, he said. This is the most significant thing we have recovered from the archive. When the right situation presents itself, we will know. She nodded. She rolled the scroll carefully and returned it to its protective case. On his wrist, Drake pulsed once with the rhythm he had come to identify as the dragon saying something without words, the specific quality of a very old and very patient being that has learned to express itself in frequencies rather than language. Issei understood it. He would understand it for a very long time. Chapter 14. The first real field. The first genuine field mission came at the end of Team 7's third month, and it was not supposed to be a genuine field mission. The mission profile was C rank, which the Hokage's office had classified as a scouting assignment to confirm route viability for a merchant caravan operating between Konoha and a mid-range trading post 3 days' travel to the southwest. The expected challenges were weather assessment, road condition documentation, and identification of any active bandit presence in the area, which intelligence suggested was minimal. Intelligence, as Issei had noted in his previous life and was confirming in this one, was frequently minimal in ways that were not precisely accurate. They were 8 hours out from the village, moving through the forest road at the steady mid-range pace that Ray set and maintained with the ease of someone who covered ground like this for whom it was simply a form of thinking, when the 6 eyes registered something that was not weather and not bandits, and not anything the mission briefing had prepared them for. Issei stopped. This was not dramatic, but Ray noticed it within 2 steps, which was a function of how well she had learned to read his tells, and she stopped as well, and Karen and Naruto stopped behind her. What, Ray said? Grade 2, he said. Approximately 2 kilometers ahead. On the road. The team was quiet for a moment. A grade 2 was not a grade 3. A grade 2 was not a grade 4 that had grown beyond its original parameters. A grade 2 was a coherent, purposeful, significantly dangerous cursed spirit that had been generating and accumulating for a very long time and had crossed the threshold into something that was not simply an ambient threat but an active one, a thing that could choose its targets and pursue them with intention. He had sealed one before, in theory, on the seal arrays he had built in the compound's study room. He had never encountered one in the field. Ray was reading his expression. "Can you contain it?" she said. "Not should you, not are you ready." "Can you?" he assessed. The road ahead, as the 6 eyes traced it forward, had the open spatial structure he needed for the anchor points of a containment array. The Grade 2 was stationary, which meant it was feeding on something in the area, which meant it had not registered them yet. The forest on both sides provided adequate anchor surfaces for the outer ring. "Yes," he said. "I need 15 minutes to place the array and approximately 5 more to activate it. Naruto and Karen need to keep it occupied and away from the array's activation points for the activation phase. Sensei, I need you to ensure the outer ring anchors are not disrupted during the process." "Describe the array architecture," Ray said. He described it in 2 minutes. She asked 4 questions. He answered them. "All right," she said. "Karen, Naruto, you heard the tactical picture. The containment anchor points Issei identifies are not to be disrupted under any circumstances. Everything else is flexible." She looked at all of them. "This is a real field situation. Treat it accordingly. No unnecessary risks." She looked at Naruto specifically when she said the last part. Naruto had the expression of someone who had been about to ask whether unnecessary was defined strictly or loosely and had decided, reading the room, that this was not the moment. They moved up. The Grade 2 was feeding on the ruins of a way station that had been abandoned some years earlier. Its walls crumbled and its roof collapsed, the accumulated sorrow of the travelers who had sheltered there over decades of use and then the specific grief of the people who had passed through it in its final operational year, when the road had become less safe and every stop felt like it might be the last. It was large. Not the largest thing the 6 eyes had ever registered, but large enough that standing at the edge of the way station's clearing and looking at it directly, through both the 6 eyes and the 2 Tomo Sharingan, was an experience that required a specific quality of steadiness. He was steady. He had been practicing steadiness in the face of what he could see for 10 years. He placed the first anchor mark in the tree line to the north without drawing the Grade 2's attention, which required moving at a speed and silence that the Sharingan's perceptive processing facilitated. The second mark went into the stone wall of the way station's collapsed eastern face. The third required crossing within 40 meters of the Grade 2 itself, and this was where Naruto provided the distraction that the plan required. Naruto's approach to distraction was comprehensive and loud and completely effective. He came in from the south, creating 3 shadow clones on approach, and the Grade 2 oriented toward him with the heavy, deliberate turning of something that had been settled into its feeding state, and was now forced to register an active disruption. It was fast, faster than a Grade 3 in the same way that a fully mature thing is faster than a developing one, but Naruto's clone distribution made targeting him specifically difficult, and Karen's Uzumaki chain seals, which she had been refining for precisely this kind of crowd and contain role, wrapped around the Grade 2's lower mass with the sound of heavy chain links finding their purchase. It was not enough to hold it. It was enough to keep it in place for 3 seconds at a time, which was enough for the placement of the 3rd anchor, and then the 4th. He placed the 5th anchor at a dead run, drawing cursed energy through the gear's resonance point and letting it flow into the seal character rather than activating the gear itself, and the 5-point network came alive in the dark red and black frequency as he reached the center point and channeled the binding activation. The Grade 2 felt it. It turned from Naruto's clones toward the source of the resonance architecture's pull with the specific intentionality of something that recognizes what is being done to it, and is not willing. It took 11 steps toward him before the activation reached critical threshold. Issei stood at the center point and held the activation steady and met the Grade 2's momentum with the resonance architecture's ambient pull, the binding logic saying what it always said: the thing you are carrying can exist here in a form that does not demand expansion. The grief you are made of has a place it can rest. This is a different kind of containment than a cage. The Grade 2 stopped. It stood 7 meters from him. They regarded each other. The binding completed. It took another 3 minutes for the full compression, the Grade 2's coherent mass contracting into the anchor stone he had prepared at the center of the array with the slow inevitability of something that had found the only configuration available to it. When it was done, the clearing was quiet, and the ruined way station held the compressed silence of a place where something had happened and then been resolved, and Naruto was sitting on a fallen wall catching his breath with 3 clones dispersed around him. That was, Naruto said, extremely impressive, and also we should talk about the part where you stood there while it walked toward you. I was holding the activation, Issei said. Moving would have destabilized the array. There were 11 steps, Karen said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. I counted them, he said. Rei had come to stand beside him. She was looking at the anchor stone and the compression seal, her expression carrying the specific quality of a teacher who has watched a student execute something she has been preparing them for, and is now deciding how to respond. The activation held under forward pressure, she said. Yes. The resonance pull was stronger than the entity's forward drive after the 5th step. The last 6 steps were inertial rather than actively driven. She was quiet for a moment. You were not frightened, she said. He thought about this honestly. No, he said. I was very focused. Focused and frightened occupy different enough cognitive space that one effectively crowds out the other if the focus is complete enough. Rei looked at him. That, she said, is something you developed, not something you were born with. Yes, he said. I developed it very early, because what I could see from birth required that I develop it or be overwhelmed by it. But yes. She put a hand on his shoulder briefly, the gesture of a teacher acknowledging a student's work in the specific way that carries more weight than a longer statement. Then she turned to the rest of the team. We document this as a mission complication and report to the Hokage on return. The mission itself continues. We have a road survey to complete. They completed the road survey. The caravan route was viable. They returned to Konoha in the evening of the 3rd day with a complete mission report, and 1 additional sealed Grade 2 that had not been in the briefing. The Hokage's assistant, who received the mission report, looked at the addendum for a long moment before carrying it through to the inner office. The Hokage's private briefing happened the following morning. Issei sat across from Hiruzen with the full mission report, and the sealed stone from the way station, which he had brought because the Hokage was a practical man who valued physical evidence of significant events. Rei sat beside him. The Hokage's senior advisor sat in the corner, taking notes. Hiruzen read the report. He looked at the sealed stone. He looked at Issei. A Grade 2, he said. Yes, sir. In the field. Using a live array placed under opposition from the target entity. Yes, sir. The old man was quiet for a moment. Rei-san, he said. He executed the containment correctly and without error, Rei said. The team's support was appropriate, and functioned as planned. There was a moment of risk during the activation phase that was calculated and accepted as necessary rather than uncontrolled. My assessment is that the outcome was the result of genuine preparation and correct execution rather than luck. The Hokage folded his hands. I want to establish a formal protocol, he said, for the identification and handling of cursed spirit entities at threat grade levels. Not public. Handled through the ANBU intelligence structure, with a small classification. The knowledge base you and your colleagues have been building over the past 3 years is the foundation. Issei looked at him. You want to formalize it, he said. I want to ensure that when you are in the field and encounter a situation like yesterday's, you have the institutional backing and the classification clearance to handle it without paperwork complications. The Hokage's expression was dry. And I want to ensure that if something larger than a Grade 2 presents itself somewhere in the elemental nations, there is a protocol for responding to it rather than a 10-year-old making field decisions without support structure. I am 12, Issei said. Yes, said the Hokage. That was rather my point. Issei thought about the 47 entries in the catalog. He thought about the Grade 2 in the way station ruins. He thought about the living seal protocol in Karen's secured case, and the infinite boost domain architecture still being refined and the things that were, according to his careful ongoing projection of the cursed energy accumulation rates in the elemental nations, going to start presenting as Grade 1 or special grade entities within the next several years. I accept, he said. With one condition. The Hokage raised an eyebrow. My team works as a unit, Issei said. Any protocol that involves me involves them. They have equal access to the institutional support, and equal role in the classification structure. Hiruzen looked at him for a moment. You are protecting them, the advisor said from the corner. I am recognizing reality, Issei said. Naruto contains the 9 tails, whose relationship to cursed energy is direct and significant and has not been studied. Karen has recovered the most complete Uzumaki living seal documentation that exists. Their contributions to this work are not incidental. The Hokage was quiet. Then he picked up his brush. All 3 of them, he said. Yes, sir, he wrote. The brush moved with the careful authority of official documentation. The advisor's pen moved in the corner. Outside the window, Konoha went about its mourning. The memorial stone stood in its usual place. The cursed energy in the village ran at its lowest level in the 12 years since Issei's birth. The compound's accumulated grievance lighter by 47 sealed entities. The village's shadow less heavy than it had been. He was 12 years old, sitting in the Hokage's office, watching the institutional architecture adjust itself around the reality he had been building towards since before he could walk. It felt, he reflected, like the beginning of something that was just now becoming large enough to see. Chapter 15. The Domain, the Dragon, and the Space Between. The Infinite Boost Domain, as a theoretical construct, had existed in Issei's notebooks since he was 8 years old. As a practical architecture, it had been under construction for 4 years. As something that was close to functional, it had arrived, with the specific quality of a long-approaching thing finally reaching its destination, in the weeks following the way station mission. The theoretical foundation was complete. The seal architecture was mapped. The activation sequence had been refined over 18 separate iteration cycles. The 3-ring resonance structure that the Hokage had noticed in the notebook 4 years earlier had expanded into a 9-ring architecture of such density and precision that Karen, who could read it fluently, had spent a full afternoon reviewing it, and then looked up and said, "If you can actually execute this, it is the most complex single activation seal structure I have ever seen." If was the operative word. The Infinite Boost Domain was not a seal you placed in a location and activated from a safe distance. It was a seal you carried in your own chakra network, written into the flow points of your own circulatory system, a living architecture that existed as long as you maintained the will and the chakra investment to sustain it, and that could be externalized, at the cost of significant sustained effort, into the space around you. The externalization was the part he could not yet do. He could carry the internal architecture. He had been carrying it for 2 years, the 9-ring structure existing as a constant low-level presence in his chakra flow, comfortable and stable and invisible to anyone not looking for it. The Sharingan had helped him write it into himself, the ability to see his own chakra network with the same precision he brought to everything else, making the self-modification process something that could be done accurately rather than approximately. The externalization required something that was not simply more chakra. It required a specific quality of will that he had been trying to describe to himself for 2 years and had not yet fully named. He was in the grove at the eastern edge of the compound on a Sunday morning when Drake named it. "It requires surrender," the dragon said. Issei looked up from the activation attempt he had been working on. "Not defeat," Drake continued. "Not giving up. Surrender in the specific sense of releasing the need to control the output. You are trying to execute the externalization as a controlled deployment, managing every point of the expansion simultaneously. But the 9-ring architecture was not designed to be managed point by point. It was designed to be trusted." Issei was quiet. "You have been cataloging since birth as a way of managing an overwhelming world," Drake said. "You have never fully stopped. The domain requires you to stop, just once, just at the moment of externalization. To send it out and trust that the architecture you built is sound rather than monitoring every part of it as it expands." The morning was quiet in the grove. A bird called somewhere in the compound's inner trees. The old sealed stone from Issei's first containment work, still stable after 5 years, sat in the hollow of its tree, unchanged. "I built the architecture," Issei said slowly. "Over 4 years. 9 rings. 18 iteration cycles. Yes. And I need to trust it. Yes." A pause. "You trusted Karen's information in the field exercise. You trusted Naruto's instincts in the way station. You trusted Rei's assessment of the Grade 2 engagement. You have been learning to do this with people for 2 years. The domain is not a person. No. But you built it. In some sense, it is an expression of you. Trusting it is a different form of the same practice. He thought about that for a long time. Then he stood, and he found the activation point in his chakra network, and he let the 9-ring structure build to the externalization threshold, and at the moment that required the controlled deployment he had been attempting, he released the control instead. The domain expanded. It was not loud. It was not visually dramatic in the way of high-level ninjutsu techniques, which tended to express themselves in light and sound and environmental disruption. The infinite boost domain was more like a change in the quality of the air, a shift in the way the space felt, the difference between a room that was simply a room and a room that had been set for something specific. Within the activated field, the resonance architecture was ambient. The binding logic was the default rule rather than an imposed exception. Cursed energy moved in the patterns of the 9-ring structure as though it had always moved that way. He stood in the center of it, and felt the domain around him and felt, for the first time, what complete external expression of the architecture was like. It was very quiet. It was the specific quietness of a system that was operating correctly, all of its parts in their designed relationship with each other, the whole generating an output that the parts alone could not have produced. He held it for 45 seconds before the chakra cost became significant, and he released it. He sat down on the grove floor. There, Drake said. There, he agreed. He told Ray about the domain 2 days later, in the training ground after the morning session, with the specific directness that their relationship had established as its working register. She received the information with the attention she brought to everything significant, which meant without immediate reaction, processing first and responding second. 45 seconds of sustained externalization, she said, on the first successful execution. I have run it 3 more times since. The longest was 90 seconds. The limiting factor is not the architecture itself but the sustained chakra cost of maintaining the externalization against the natural tendency of the field to contract back to the internal configuration, which means with training you can extend it significantly. The architecture is stable at externalization. Once the control-release issue is addressed, the extension is a matter of chakra conditioning and tolerance for the specific quality of the sustained effort. Both of those are trainable. Ray was quiet for a moment, looking at the training ground. I need to see it, she said. He activated it in the center of the training ground. Ray was a skilled enough sensor type to feel the field change when the domain engaged, and he watched her register it with the expression of someone who has been briefed on a thing and is now encountering the thing itself and finding that the gap between the briefing and the reality is significant. She reached into the domain's field and placed the chakra diagnostic technique, the kind used to assess a ceiling structure's stability, and then she looked at the result and looked at him. The resonance is coherent across the entire field, she said. It is not degrading at the edges. The binding logic is genuinely ambient rather than targeted. Yes. This is, she said carefully, what I have been theorizing toward from the 7-ring compression architecture. For 5 years. You have executed a practical version of it. He looked at her. You were working toward this, he said. I was working toward the theoretical possibility of it, she said. I did not have the practical path. The 9-ring architecture is. She stopped. She looked at the domain field. Where did you develop the cursed energy integration layer? That is not derivable from standard Fuinjutsu theory. He thought about how much to say. He thought about Ray, who had been working in parallel toward the same destination he had been approaching from a different direction, who had the 7-ring foundation and the decades of field experience, and the theoretical depth that had been the most useful adult input into his work since the Hokage's archive access. He thought about his mother on the garden wall. I will show you, he said. All of it. From the beginning. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. They sat down in the training ground, in the activated domain field, and he began to explain how the 6 eyes perceived cursed energy, and what he had derived from that perception and why the 9-ring architecture was the structure it was, all the way back to the first containment seal he had drawn in a 7-year-old cipher notebook on a night when the compound had been full of things that no one else could see. Ray listened without interrupting for an hour and 40 minutes. Then she picked up her own notebook, the one she carried with the published resonance work still annotated in the margins with her ongoing revisions, and she opened it to a page she had been working on for years and set it beside his 9-ring diagram. The two architectures, arrived at from different starting points over different spans of time, were not identical. But the structural relationship between them was unmistakable. They were, Issei saw with the 6 eyes pattern recognition firing on full, the same system expressed in 2 different notational languages by 2 different practitioners who had been working in the same direction without knowing the other was doing the same. I have been calling this the resonant binding field, Ray said. In my unpublished notes. I have been calling it the infinite boost domain, he said. A pause. They are the same thing, she said. Yes, he said. More or less. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the 2 notebooks side by side, the young student's cipher-coded development work and the veteran Jonin's decades of theoretical refinement, laying there together in the afternoon light of the training ground like 2 different rivers that had just discovered they were flowing toward the same sea. All right, Ray said, with the specific quality of a person accepting a reality that is larger than they expected. Let's build it properly. The team's 3rd month ended with a review session at the Hokage's office, a standard periodic assessment of new team progress that Hiruzen conducted personally for teams with unusual classification profiles. Ray gave the assessment report. She covered the combat training progress, the SEAL theory development, the way station mission, the domain breakthrough, and the formal institutional acknowledgement of the Cursed Spirit Protocol. She was concise and accurate, and did not editorialize, which was the standard she held herself to in formal reporting, and which Issei had come to recognize as the highest quality of professional respect one could offer the person receiving the report. The Hokage listened. He asked 6 questions. He received 6 complete answers. Then he looked at Issei. You came to me when you were 7 years old with a notebook, he said. With a 3-ring seal architecture and a list of things you had been doing in this village that no one else could see. I gave you access and authorization because the work you showed me was too significant to restrict on the basis of age. Issei waited. I want to tell you, the old man said, that the thing you have been building since then is not simply significant. It is foundational. The classification of cursed spirit entities. The containment protocols. The domain architecture. The living seal recovery from the Uzumaki records. He paused. These are not the work of a genin team in their 3rd month. They are the groundwork of a discipline that does not yet have a name in this world. The room was quiet. It needs a name, Issei said. The Hokage looked at him. What do you propose? He thought about it. He thought about cursed energy and chakra and the 2 worlds whose knowledge he carried, the one that had called practitioners sorcerers and the one that had called them shinobi, and the specific place this work occupied between and beyond both of those categories. Resonance sorcery, he said. The practice of working with cursed energy through structured resonance rather than opposed force. The use of binding vows and living seal architectures to engage with entities generated by human negative emotion. The creation of domains in which that engagement can be conducted on stable ground. The Hokage was quiet for a moment. Resonance sorcery, he repeated. Provisionally. A long pause. The advisor in the corner was writing. Provisionally, the Hokage agreed, with the expression of a man who knows when a provisional name is going to become a permanent one. Ray was looking at the training ground outside the window, and Issei did not need the 6 eyes to read what was in her face. He was 12 years old, and the discipline he had been building since before he could explain what he was building had just been named, and outside the window the village held its ordinary afternoon, the memorial stone standing in its place, the cursed energy at its lowest level in living memory, the compound lights coming on one by one as the evening arrived. Warm and steady and entirely unlike the darkness that had accumulated there once, in a history that was no longer the history this world was going to have. He thought about all of it. He thought about the shape of a year, and the shape of a life, and the shape of a thing that was only beginning. He went home. Act 4. Everything that cannot be sealed. Chapter 16. The Chunin exams and the weight of being watched. The invitation to the Chunin exams arrived in the 4th month of Team 7's operation, which was earlier than standard and which Ray accepted with the composed expression of a jonin who has been told something she was expecting and had prepared for. She told the team on a Tuesday morning, standing in the center of the training ground with the notification scroll in one hand and her other hand resting at her side with the casual readiness of a person who has held dangerous things for so long that the posture is simply natural. Naruto's response was immediate and physical, a jump that took him approximately 3 feet off the ground and a sound that the 6 eyes classified as pure uncomplicated joy expressed at full volume. Karen's response was to go very still and then produce her assessment notebook from her bag and begin writing, which was her version of the same emotion process through a different temperament. Issei stood and listened and catalogued the information, the exam schedule, the known general structure of the 3-stage format, the intelligence available on this cycle's participating teams and their home villages, and the specific implications of their own team's unusual classification profile for how they would be perceived and approached by other participants. The implications were significant. A team with their documented ability set, even partially documented, was going to draw attention at the Chunin exams. The exams were a political event as much as a competitive one, a place where hidden villages assessed each other's developing talent, and where individual shinobi built reputations that would precede them into their careers. He had understood this since he first read about the exam format in the clan library at age 6. He had been thinking about how to navigate it since the Hokage had first mentioned the team classification structure. The question was not whether to participate seriously. The question was what being observed by everyone in the room changed about what it was appropriate to show. He thought about what his father had told him before the academy assessment. Show what is true at the level appropriate to this stage. Do not perform below your actual level for the sake of politics. That is a habit that becomes permanent if you let it. He thought about this carefully. The Chunin exams were not the academy assessment. The stakes were different, and the audience was different, and the political weight was substantially heavier. But the core principle was the same. You could calibrate how much you showed without misrepresenting what you were. He discussed this with Rei that evening, after the others had gone home. She was sitting on the training ground fence in the late evening light, looking at the darkening sky above Konoha, and she listened to his analysis with the full attention she gave to things she considered worth her full attention, which was a category she maintained with some selectivity. You are thinking about the optics, she said, when he finished. I am thinking about the information we give away, he said. The resonance sorcery discipline is not ready to be public knowledge. The domain architecture is not ready for foreign intelligence services to have an accurate picture of. Naruto's relationship to the Nine Tails is its own category of political complexity. And Karen's Uzumaki restoration work, if it becomes widely known, will attract attention from parties who may not have constructive interests in Uzumaki heritage. Rei was quiet. All of that is true, she said. And your instinct to protect the team's strategic information is correct. She paused. But I want to offer a different frame for the same considerations. He waited. The Chunin exams are not just about what you reveal, she said. They are about what you learn. About the other teams? About the political landscape of the shinobi world as it exists right now. About your own capacity under observation and pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. She looked at him. You have been operating in a relatively controlled information environment. The archive access, the Hokage's support structure, the team dynamic we have built. The exams put you in a genuinely unpredictable space. That is not a threat to manage. It is the entire point. He thought about this. You are saying that the calibration question is less important than the observation opportunity. I am saying they are equal. And that if you spend the entire exams managing your information exposure, you will miss what the exams are actually for. The evening was quiet. A few lights had come on in the village. The memorial stone was a dark shape at the edge of the central plaza. All right, he said. I will try to do both. You will succeed at both, she said. That was never in doubt. I just wanted to make sure you were looking in the right direction. The first stage of the Chunin exams was a written examination administered in a large hall with 64 participants from multiple hidden villages, seated at individual desks, with rules that prohibited communication of any kind between participants. The rules were, of course, the point. Issei understood the actual structure of the first stage within 4 minutes of the examination beginning, which was approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds after most of the other participants had begun to suspect it, and considerably before any of them had fully articulated the logic. The exam was not testing knowledge. It was testing the ability to gather intelligence from an environment that was nominally sealed against intelligence gathering, using whatever perceptual and technical abilities you had available, and to do so without being identified by the 10 proctors distributed through the room. He had the 6 eyes, the 2 Tomo Sharingan, and 3 years of experience observing things that were not supposed to be observed. The examination was, from his perspective, a slightly unusual exercise in a form of practice he had been conducting since birth. He answered the questions he could answer from his own knowledge, which was most of them. He observed the room systematically, identifying the participants who were actively gathering rather than simply guessing, noting the methods they were using and the degree of skill with which they were concealing the methods, and cataloging the information about competing teams that was available from the behavioral data alone, independent of any actual exam answers. By the end of the first hour he had a preliminary profile of 41 of the 63 other participants, and had identified 7 teams whose ability sets suggested they would be significant factors in the subsequent stages. He answered the 10th question, which was the actual final test, correctly. He passed the examination without drawing proctor attention, which was, he had decided, the right calibration for the first stage. He had capabilities that would have allowed him to gather more dramatically. But the point was not the drama. The point was the information. Naruto passed by refusing to give up in a way that was, even by Naruto's standards, unusually committed. Karen passed by leveraging the Uzumaki sensory ability she had been quietly developing for a year, identifying the answers through a perceptual method that did not technically violate the stated rules against communication because it did not involve communication in the conventional sense. In the holding area after the first stage, Karen looked at Issei. The team in the 3rd row, she said. Sand Village. The girl in the center. She was doing something with the proctor positioning that I could not fully track. Tamari, Issei said. Yes. She was reading the proctor's sidelines and adjusting her gathering method in real time based on proctor attention distribution. Very precise spatial awareness. Her brother, the one on the left, has a sealed entity whose signature is unusual. I want more information on that before the 2nd stage. Karen made a note. The team from Rain, she said. Nagato Uzumaki, he said. The one with the silver hair. His chakra signature is the most unusual thing in this room. He has 6 distinct chakra points that operate independently of his primary network. I do not have a classification for it. Karen's pen stopped. Uzumaki, she said. Yes. The Rain Village affiliation is interesting given the Uzumaki heritage. I want to know more about that too. Naruto had been listening from the bench beside them. You got all of that from sitting in a room for an hour, he said. I was observing, Issei said. You are always observing, Naruto said, without accusation. Do you ever just be somewhere? Issei considered this. Observing is how I am somewhere, he said. It is my version of being present. Naruto looked at him for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. I think I understand that. This was, coming from Naruto, who understood things about people that most people miss by being too busy thinking to simply feel them, a more significant statement than it appeared. Issei filed it carefully. The 2nd stage took place in a forest. The Forest of Death was accurately named. It was large enough to get genuinely lost in, dense enough to remove reliable navigational references within an hour of entry, populated with fauna that had been developing in a sealed high-tension chakra environment for long enough to express the results of that development in their physical forms, and saturated with cursed energy at a level that put it at the highest ambient concentration Issei had encountered outside of a specific location he had been tracking for 2 years and had been hoping not to think about during the exams. He thought about it immediately and in detail. The Forest of Death's cursed energy was old. It was not the fresh accumulation of recent suffering but the deep, sedimentary weight of a place that had been the site of conflict and death for a very long time, layer upon layer of negative emotion compressed into the soil and the roots and the specific quality of the air, and it had produced, at 2 locations he identified within the first 30 minutes of the team's entry, entities that his classification system placed at Grade 2 with possible Grade 1 developmental indicators. He told the team immediately. Grade 2, Karen said. 2 of them. Possibly developing toward Grade 1. The Grade 1 threshold requires a coherent purpose beyond simple destructive expansion, and I cannot assess purposefulness from the cursed energy signature alone without closer observation. But the scale is consistent with long-term accumulation in a high-conflict environment. Ray, who had been given proctor authority within the forest as part of Team 7's special classification protocol, was listening with her specific attention face. Locations, she said. He described them. She cross-referenced with her Jonin level map. The official assessment is that the forest is dangerous but manageable for Chunin level teams, she said. The cursed entities are not part of that assessment because no one else can perceive them. The official assessment is correct for the fauna and environmental hazards, he said. It is incomplete in the specific way of assessments that are missing a category entirely. A pause. We complete the stage objective first, Ray said. The scroll acquisition. Then, if the team's condition allows and the entities have not moved significantly, we address them before exiting. In that order. Understood, Issei said. The scroll acquisition took 4 hours. They encountered 2 other teams. One from Grass Village that made the mistake of treating Naruto as the weakest element of the group and discovered its error when Naruto created 17 shadow clones in a space too small to effectively target them, and one from Stone Village whose leader had a sealing style that Karen identified as a Wagakure standard and that Issei classified as interesting but not a priority. They completed the objective, obtained both required scrolls through legitimate exchange with the Stone team who were trading rather than fighting, and then turned toward the first of the 2 Grade 2 locations. The first Grade 2 was in a clearing near the western perimeter, feeding on something that had died there recently, the freshness of the grief in its composition suggesting it had grown significantly in the past week on whatever had happened in that clearing. He set the array in 11 minutes. The forest's ambient cursed energy made the anchor points take less work than usual, the resonance architecture finding purchase in the saturated environment with the ease of water finding channels that were already carved. The binding completed in 3 minutes, which was faster than any previous Grade 2 containment. Ray was watching the process with the expression she wore when she was learning something about the system by watching it operate in new conditions. The ambient cursed energy, she said. It is not complicating the array. It is facilitating it. Yes, Issei said. The resonance architecture uses the ambient energy as a medium. In a low-energy environment, I have to create the resonance conditions artificially. Here the conditions are already present. It is like the difference between drawing a seal in dry sand and drawing it in wet clay. The implications of that for battlefield deployment, she said, are significant, he agreed. A location with high ambient cursed energy makes the domain easier to establish, not harder. The environments where cursed entities are most dangerous are also the environments where the domain is most effective. Ray looked at the sealed stone. Issei, she said. Yes. I want you to attempt the domain externalization in this environment. Not for the second Grade 2. As a controlled exercise, now, while conditions are favorable and I am here to observe. He looked at the clearing. He looked at the ambient cursed energy density, which his 6 eyes read as approximately 3 times the standard village level. He activated the infinite boost domain. It expanded in 2 seconds instead of the 4 it had required in the training ground. It reached a radius of 30 meters without degradation and held there, stable and coherent, the 9-ring architecture settling into the saturated environment with the specific quality of something finding its natural habitat. He held it for 4 minutes and 20 seconds before releasing it. Ray was standing in the domain field with her eyes closed, reading it with the chakra diagnostic technique she had used in the training ground, and when he released it she opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was not surprise exactly but was something close to it. 4 minutes in a saturated field, she said. In the training ground you are reaching 90 seconds. The ambient energy is reducing the maintenance cost significantly, he said. Perhaps by 60%. The architecture is drawing on the environmental conditions rather than relying entirely on my own chakra. Which means in field conditions, she said slowly, the domain is considerably more sustainable than the training ground exercises would suggest. Yes. Naruto was sitting on a fallen tree looking at the space the domain had occupied with the expression he wore when he was connecting something to the Nine Tails chakra experience, The specific thoughtful quality of someone who is doing comparative analysis at an instinctive level. The fox gets stronger when there is a lot of negative chakra around, he said. Not weaker. Stronger. Cursed energy is generated by negative emotion, Issei said. The Nine Tails is a creature born from the accumulated negative emotional energy of humanity. Its relationship to cursed energy is not incidental. It is foundational. So we are, Naruto said slowly, kind of the same. Your domain and the fox. We both get stronger in the places where things have been bad. The clearing was quiet around them. Yes, Issei said. That is one way to understand it. Naruto thought about this for a while. Then he stood up and said, okay. Second grade 2. Let's go. They went. Chapter 17. Gaara of the Sand and the Thing He Carries. He met Gaara in the second day of the forest stage, on a path between the first and second grade 2 locations, in the specific way that meetings happen in the forest of death, without warning and with all of the weight that the context placed on them. Gaara was alone. His siblings were somewhere in the forest, separated by whatever the first day had produced, and he stood in the middle of the path with the absolute stillness of a person who had stopped moving not because they were resting but because movement had temporarily lost its purpose. The sand that surrounded him in a slow orbit said several things about his emotional state, none of which required the six eyes to read. What the six eyes read was something else. The entity sealed within Gaara was not a cursed spirit. It was something much older and more specific, a tanuki demon, Shikaku, whose chakra signature had the particular quality of something that had been compressed beyond its natural state for a very long time, and that was expressing the displeasure of that compression in continuous, low-level pressure against the seal that contained it. The cursed energy interaction was not like Naruto's, which was deep and structural and had achieved a kind of homeostasis over Naruto's lifetime. Gaara's interaction with Shikaku was active and hostile, the seal designed to contain rather than coexist, the entity fighting it constantly, and the cost of that constant fight was written in every line of the boy standing on the path before him. He had never slept. Issei knew this from the intelligence he had gathered in the first stage and from what the six eyes told him about the specific quality of the exhaustion in Gaara's chakra signature, which was not the tiredness of an active day but the accumulated weight of years of sleeplessness. A body that had not had access to the restoration that sleep provided and that had built compensatory mechanisms at a significant cost to everything else. He was 12 years old. He was alone. He was carrying something that had been trying to destroy him from the inside since birth. Issei stood on the path and looked at him with the complete attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. Gaara looked back. His eyes had the specific quality of someone who had been looked at in many ways, mostly unpleasant, and was waiting to classify this one. You are the Uchiha, Gaara said. His voice was flat, not the flatness of no emotion but the flatness of someone who had learned to keep emotion below the surface because the surface was too costly a place for it. Yes, Issei said. You placed the seal in the clearing to the northwest. Issei read the statement carefully. It was both an identification of what he had done and a question about what kind of person could do it, and underneath both of those things it was something that the six eyes classified as the specific register of a deeply lonely person who has just encountered something they did not expect to be able to recognize. Yes, he said. You could feel it. Shikaku could feel it, Gaara said. It went quiet for approximately 3 minutes. After the seal was placed. That has not happened before. The path was silent except for the forest's ambient sounds. The sand around Gaara continued its slow orbit. The resonance architecture, Issei said carefully. The seal creates a field in which cursed energy, which is related to the negative emotional component of tailed beast chakra, exists in a stable rather than an actively expanding state. For an entity like Shikaku, whose fundamental nature involves constant pressure against its containment, that field would feel like the pressure being acknowledged rather than fought. Gaara looked at him. You understand what it is, Gaara said. Not the seal. The thing inside him. Yes, Issei said. A long pause. The sand moved in its orbit, slower now than it had been when they first encountered each other. My father, Gaara said, tried to have me killed 4 times before I was 6. The people of Suna fear me. My siblings tolerate me for strategic purposes. The entity inside me has been trying to consume my mind since before I could form complete sentences. He said all of this with the flat precision of someone reading a document they have memorized. I do not have a framework for people who look at what I am and are not afraid. Issei thought about this. I have been perceiving things that other people could not see since birth, he said. My first instinct about any unusual thing is to understand it, not to be afraid of it. That is not a virtue. It is just how I am built. Gaara looked at him for a long moment. Why did you seal the entity in the clearing instead of destroying it? Because it was made of accumulated grief, Issei said. Not malice. Grief that had grown beyond what any individual person could contain and had become something else. Destroying it would have destroyed the grief, which would have destroyed something real, something that belonged to the people who had felt it. The seal gives it a form that cannot cause harm. Gaara was quiet. The sand moved very slowly now. The 6 eyes read the emotional field around him as something that was not quite a shift, more like a suspension, a system that had been running in one mode for so long that encountering a different possibility had caused it to pause rather than change. If I asked you, Gaara said, whether a different kind of seal was possible for what is inside me. Not to destroy Shikaku. To give it a form that cannot cause harm. Issei thought about the living seal protocol in Karen's secured case. He thought about the initialization conditions, both parties informed and entering the agreement voluntarily. He thought about Shikaku, who had been compressed and fought, and contained by force for longer than he could estimate, and what voluntary might mean for something that had never been offered an alternative. The theory exists, he said. The practical architecture is not fully developed. I would need time and I would need to understand Shikaku's specific nature more completely than I do. How much time? I do not know. I am not giving you a vague answer to avoid commitment. I genuinely do not know yet, because the problem is one I have not encountered before. The entities I have sealed have been non-sapient. Shikaku is not. Gaara looked at him. Non-sapient, he said, without self-awareness. Without purpose beyond expansion. Shikaku has both. That changes the architecture of any engagement significantly. Another long pause. I will find you after the exam, Gaara said. Not as a threat. As a statement. I understand, Issei said. Gaara looked at him for one more moment. Then he walked past him down the path, the sand settling into a lower, slower orbit as he went, and he did not look back. Issei stood on the path for a moment after Gaara had gone, and he thought about what had just been asked, and what it would require, and whether he was ready. He was not ready. He knew this with the specific clarity of the 6 eyes, which did not soften assessments for convenience. He was going to become ready. He knew that with a different kind of clarity, the kind that had been with him since before he could walk, the certainty of a person who has never been able to accept that a problem was unsolvable simply because it was large. He continued down the path toward the 2nd grade 2. The preliminary round of the Chunin exams, held in the tower at the forest center, reduced 64 participants to 20 by a series of one-on-one matches designed to assess individual combat ability. Issei's first match was against the Sound Village genin, whose technique involved vibration-based sound attacks that disrupted chakra flow by resonating at frequencies that interfered with the target's internal circulation. It was a sophisticated and specific ability, well designed for neutralizing opponents who relied on chakra-dependent techniques. He activated the boosted gear at the start of the match and spent the first 40 seconds of the 3-minute engagement mapping the vibration frequencies with the 6 eyes and the Sharingan simultaneously. The Sharingan tracked the physical source points of the attack. The 6 eyes tracked the frequency signatures in the ambient chakra field around his body and identified the specific resonance points where the vibration was finding purchase. At 45 seconds he had enough data to adjust. He was not immune to the vibration attacks, but the Dragon Slayer form's emphasis on dynamic body weapon integration included, as a consequence of the principles Guy had laid out, a specific quality of physical groundedness that made the vibration interference less effective than it had been designed to be. A body that was trained to maintain structural integrity under shifting force conditions was also, as it turned out, more resistant to being vibrated apart than a body trained for more conventional combat. He won the match cleanly at 2 minutes and 20 seconds without activating the domain, or reaching more than the third boost cycle. The proctor recorded the result and called the next match. In the observation area, Karen was watching with the expression she wore when she was running parallel assessments. "You mapped the frequencies," she said quietly, when he returned. "Yes. They operate on a principle adjacent to seal resonance. If I had more time I could probably develop a specific counterseal, but for the match, physical resistance was sufficient." "You sandbagged," she said. "I showed what was necessary." "That is not the same thing." She looked at him for a moment. "Sometimes," she said, "the difference between those two things is thinner than you think it is." He considered this. "You may be right," he said. Karen's match was next. She won it with a combination of chain seal deployment and Uzumaki vitality that her opponent, who had been briefed on the team's file, had not fully accounted for. Naruto's match after that ended in a shadow clone confusion that produced a result more through exhaustion than any single decisive technique, which was also accurate to Naruto's fundamental strategic philosophy. All three of them advanced. The month between the preliminary round and the final stage was designed as training preparation time. For most teams it was an opportunity to refine whatever technique they had identified as most relevant to their opponent in the finals. For Team 7 it was a different kind of preparation. Gaara found Issei on the third day after the forest stage, as he had said he would. He came to the training ground without his siblings, which was a statement in itself, and he stood at the edge of the ground and waited with the specific quality of someone who has made a decision and is now inhabiting it without second-guessing. Issei had spent the 3 intervening days on a specific problem. Shikaku was a tailed beast, which meant its fundamental nature was the concentrated emotional energy of humanity given form and power, and, in Shikaku's specific case, a particular disposition that the seal's compression had not improved. The living seal protocol was designed for entities that could enter voluntary agreement. The question was whether Shikaku's current state, having been in a hostile containment seal for the entirety of Gaara's life, left any space for voluntary agreement, or whether the hostility had become so foundational that the entity's capacity for choice had been submerged by years of pure resistance. He had no answer to this question yet. But he had a hypothesis. He brought Karen. He explained why Gaara was there, and what had been discussed, and what the hypothesis was. She listened without interrupting, which was her version of serious engagement, and then she opened the secured case and set the living seal protocol on the table between them. Gaara looked at the scroll. "What is that?" he said. "The theoretical foundation of what you asked about," Issei said. "A living seal is an architecture that establishes a partnership rather than a cage. It requires both parties to understand what they are agreeing to and to choose it." He paused. "The significant unknown in your situation is whether Shikaku is currently capable of choosing. Not whether it would choose the agreement, but whether years of hostile containment have left it the capacity to make a choice at all." Gaara was quiet. "How do you find out?" he said. "I need to speak with it," Issei said. "Not through you. Directly. Which means entering a space adjacent to the seal that contains it and establishing resonance contact. That," Karen said from beside him, "is the part of the hypothesis I find concerning." "I know," Issei said. "Resonance contact with a tailed beast whose containment seal is adversarial could result in a significant backlash if the beast interprets the contact as another form of hostile intrusion." "I know that too. And you still want to try?" "Not today," he said. "I want to spend the preparation month building the approach framework first. The resonance contact, if we attempt it, happens when the framework is complete, and when we have accounted for the backlash scenario as well as the successful scenario." Karen looked at him. Then she looked at the living seal protocol scroll. Then she picked up her pen. "All right," she said. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you know about tailed beast chakra architecture, and I will tell you everything I know about the living seal initialization requirements, and we will find where they meet." Gaara sat on the other side of the table and watched them work. After a while, Karen pushed a diagram toward him and asked whether any of its elements matched what he had been able to observe of his own seal from the inside. He looked at it for a long time and then, carefully and in very few words, began to describe what the inside of the Shikaku seal looked and felt like from the perspective of the person it was built around. The information was more useful than anything else they had. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and by the time the light changed, Karen had 4 pages of notes, and Issei had a new section in the domain architecture notebook, and Gaara had not left, which meant something different from all the other times in his life when he had stayed in a place. Chapter 18. Hinata, Niji, and the Geometry of Inherited Pain. The final stage of the Chunin exams was held in the village's central stadium before an audience that included the Kazekage, 3 foreign village delegations, and the entire civilian and shinobi population of Konoha that could fit in the available seating. It was the most publicly visible thing Issei had done since his birth into this world. He was aware of this with the specific clarity of someone who had been thinking about public visibility as a strategic variable for years, and he had prepared for it with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything else. And in the hours before the first match he found that preparation was not the same as comfort, which was an observation he catalogued and set aside. The match schedule placed Hinata against Niji Hyuga in the 3rd match of the day. He had known this was coming. He had known it was coming since the preliminary bracket was announced, and he had read the Hyuga clan dynamics through 3 years of careful observation and the specific quality of the tension between the main and branch families that was visible in everything from Hinata's posture in the early academy days to the way Hayashi's face moved when certain topics were introduced. Niji Hyuga was 16 and a prodigy. His Byakugan was fully developed, his gentle fist technique was exceptional, and his theoretical understanding of the Hyuga style was complete in the specific way of someone who had spent years mastering a system as a form of devotion to something that was more than the technique itself. He was also, the 6 eyes read clearly from across the preparation area, carrying something that had hardened into a shape that was no longer flexible, grief and rage that had been sealed inside a story about fate and inevitability until the story had become structural rather than interpretive. He looked at Hinata the way a person looks at a symbol when what they really want to look at is the thing the symbol represents. Issei found Hinata in the preparation area before the match. She was sitting by herself, which was unusual enough that he noted it before he noted anything else. She was usually a person who sought proximity to people she trusted when she was nervous, not distance. The distance meant something specific. He sat beside her. She looked at him. Her expression was carrying more things than she usually carried at the surface, and none of them were the things he had seen her be afraid of before, which had mostly been the ordinary fears of performance and adequacy. This was something different and older. "You know what Niji is going to do," she said. It was not a question. "I know what he intends to do," he said. "I do not know exactly what he will do, because no match is fully determined by intentions. He is going to tell me that I am defined by my limitations," she said. "That is what he does. He tells people that they are bounded by fate and that fighting against those bounds is foolishness. And he is going to specifically tell me this, because..." She paused. "Because what happened to his father is something that he has turned into an argument about me, and the argument has been running for years." Issei looked at her. "What happened to his father?" he said carefully. She told him. The branching seal. The main family's absolute authority. The cage that the Hyuga branch family was born into. The specific event that had made Niji's father's death a sacrifice instead of a killing. The story that had been running in the Hyuga compound since before either of them was born. When she finished, the preparation area was quiet around them. "I have always known," she said, "that the system was wrong. I have always known that it was wrong for Niji to be bounded the way he is, and that the bitterness he carries is not irrational, it is the correct response to an unjust situation. I cannot argue with any of it." "Then what are you going to do?" Issei said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am going to fight anyway," she said. "Not because I think I will win. Because giving up is the thing he expects of me specifically, because I am the symbol of everything he resents, and giving up would confirm his entire argument. And his argument is wrong even if his anger is right." He looked at her. The 6 eyes read her chakra signature as the specific quality of someone who has found a clear thing to stand on in the middle of a complicated situation, not comfortable, not resolved, but clear. "The gentle fist aims at tenketsu points," he said. "You know the theory of your own system better than anyone I have worked with. Including in this exam. Including people who are older and stronger." "I know," she said. Your Byakugan is fully active in your left visual field, but you tend to keep your right at 70% during high-stress combat because you developed the habit when you were younger, and the full bilateral activation was exhausting. She blinked. I noticed, he said simply. You have been correcting it in training for 3 months, but under pressure the old habit reasserts. Be aware of it. She was quiet for a moment. You have been watching me that carefully, she said. I watch everyone that carefully, he said. It is not different for you. He paused, and then, because honesty was the register their relationship had always operated in, except that with you the watching started because you were interesting and has continued because you matter. Those are related but not identical reasons. Hinata looked at him with an expression that the Sharingan rendered in complete detail, all of its layers simultaneously visible, and he had the rare experience of receiving a piece of information that his cataloging had not prepared him for. He noted it. He did not have an immediate response for it. She stood. She straightened her jacket with the deliberate composure of a person putting on the version of themselves that the moment required. Thank you, she said. For the Byakugan note, and for the other thing. Both were true, he said. I know, she said. That is why they both helped. She walked toward the match area. He watched her go with the full attention of someone who understands that the next thing to happen is going to be important, and cannot be rushed. The match between Hinata and Niji was not what the audience expected. Niji was objectively more powerful, his gentle fist more refined, his combat experience deeper, his tactical intelligence formidable. These were facts, and they operated in the match as facts operated everywhere, with the mechanical consistency of gravity. What the audience had not accounted for was Hinata's quality of determination, which was not the loud, forward-leaning determination of a person who was trying to prove something to themselves, but the quiet, structural determination of a person who had found a clear thing to stand on and was standing on it. She fought for 8 minutes before the medical team intervened. 8 minutes against Niji Hyuga, at the level of development she was at, with the bilateral Byakugan activation issues she had been managing, and the accumulated weight of years of his argument directed specifically at her, was not nothing. It was not a victory. It was also not a defeat in the sense that Niji had intended, because the thing he had been trying to achieve, the confirmation of his argument, the visible collapse of the symbol, did not happen. What happened instead was that she stood up 4 times after going down. The 4th time the medical team stepped in. In the stands, Naruto was gripping the railing with white knuckles. Niji stood in the arena and looked at the result of the match with the expression of someone who has won the argument they were making and found that winning it felt different from how he had expected. In the preparation area, Issei sat with the information the match had produced and thought about the Hyuga branching seal and the living seal protocol and the fact that the work he was doing on Gaara's situation was, in its fundamental architecture, directly applicable to the oldest and most deeply embedded injustice in one of Konoha's most significant clans. He began a new section in the notebook. His own match was the 6th of the day, against a Miss Village genin whose technique involved water-based mirror constructs that trapped targets in a closed reflective environment, and then generated attacks from every reflected angle simultaneously. He had spent the preparation month studying the mirror technique from intelligence reports and from the specific quality of the user's chakra signature, which he had been observing since the preliminary round. The technique's weakness was the same as any closed environment technique's weakness. It required the target to be contained within the environment to function as designed. He was in the mirror environment for 4 seconds before he identified the construct's resonance frequency with the 6 eyes. The infinite boost domain, externalized at the technique's activation threshold, created a field in which the mirror construct's resonance frequency encountered the domain's binding logic as an ambient condition. The mirrors did not shatter. They simply stopped being operative as attack surfaces, the resonance that made them functional as reflective constructs finding itself in a field where a different resonance was the ambient rule. The match lasted 90 seconds. He won it without the boosted gear reaching the 2nd cycle. In the observation area, Ray was watching with the expression of a teacher who has watched a student use a technique in a real context for the first time and is revising her assessment of how complete the student's mastery is. In the stands, the Sand Village delegation was having a quiet conversation that Issei could not hear but could read from the body language across the arena. This was not what they had briefed for. He noted this and continued. The evening after the matches, Issei found Sai waiting for him outside the stadium. Sai was not in the exams. He had graduated with a different team placement, one that had not entered this cycle, and he had come to watch as a civilian spectator, which was not something anyone had specifically told him about, and which he had simply decided to do. He fell into step beside Issei without preamble. "The domain in the mirror match," he said. "I felt it from the stands." "You felt it?" "Not clearly. Like the air changed. Like the way a room feels different when a window has been opened somewhere." He paused. "My sensitivity has been increasing. I think the work on the classification system has been training it." Issei considered this. It was consistent with his hypothesis that the ability to perceive cursed energy was not a fixed trait but a trainable one, and that consistent engagement with the theoretical framework of cursed energy expanded the perceptual range of those with any latent sensitivity. "Are you all right with it increasing?" he said. Sai was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It was frightening when I did not have a framework for it. Now I have the classification system. The perception is data rather than noise." He paused again. "Hinata's match." "Yes." She stood up 4 times. "Yes." "The Hyuga seal," Sai said. "The one that is placed on the branch family. I have been thinking about it since you mentioned the living seal recovery. The branching seal is designed to prevent the Byakugan from being used by unauthorized parties. It is a containment seal. A hostile one." Issei looked at him. "You are thinking about whether the living seal architecture could address it," he said. "I am thinking that the branching seal and the Shikaku containment are the same category of problem," Sai said. "Not the same scale or the same entity, but the same fundamental design philosophy, contained by force rather than by agreement. And that the living seal is designed specifically for that category." The evening air was warm and the village's lights were coming on in the deepening dusk, and they walked through the streets with this between them. "The branching seal," Issei said slowly, "is not just Niji. It is the entire Hyuga branch family. Dozens of people." "Yes," I said. "Addressing it through the living seal architecture would require either a mass application, which has no precedent in the protocol, or a foundational change to the seal's design philosophy that would effectively dissolve the current seal and replace it with something different in kind." "Yes," I said again. Issei thought about Hinata standing up 4 times. He thought about Niji's expression after the match. He thought about the weight of things inherited, carried by people who had not chosen them, and the specific kind of harm that came from being sealed by someone else's decision. "Add it to the long-term project list," he said. Sai nodded. He would write it up in the morning. He knew, from years of working alongside Issei, that what went on the long-term project list did not stay there indefinitely. They walked home through the quiet evening streets, and above the village the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the Hyuga compound the branching seal sat on the people who carried it, unchanged for now but not, perhaps, forever. Chapter 19. The Sound and the Invasion. The invasion began during the 7th match of the final day. He felt it before it was visible. The cursed energy in the stadium, which had been at elevated levels since the beginning of the day for the same reason it was always elevated in spaces where people gathered in large numbers under emotionally charged conditions, shifted in the specific way he had learned to identify as the difference between ambient accumulation and directed intent. Something was using the cursed energy as a medium. Something was moving through the crowd with a purpose that the ambient energy was facilitating rather than simply coexisting with. He was on his feet before the first sound ninja came through the stadium wall. "Invasion," he said. Karen and Naruto were already moving, the communication between them in the field having reached the level of efficiency where a single word was sufficient context. The next 4 minutes were the most complex operational situation he had been in since the field began. The Sound Sand Alliance had been preparing this for months. The invasion was multi-vector, sound shinobi entering through the stadium walls, sand shinobi activating hidden positions in the crowd, a genjutsu distributed through the crowd by a technique he identified as the specific signature of something very large operating from a high position and projecting a sleep-inducing resonance through the ambient chakra field. The Kazakage's position was compromised. The Hokage was being moved to an elevated confrontation point. All of this he read in the first 40 seconds through the 6 eyes and the Sharingan, and 3 years of practice tracking multiple simultaneous points of interest in a complex environment. He made decisions in the order of the threats they represented. The civilian section of the stadium was the most immediately vulnerable, and required the most urgent response. He pulled Naruto toward the primary civilian exit corridor, and used 2 established resonance marks he had placed in the stadium structure during his preliminary walk-through, a habit he had developed for every significant venue he entered, to create a disruption field in the sleep genjutsu's propagation path. It was not a full counter. It was enough to reduce the genjutsu's effectiveness by 30% in the civilian section, which meant the rate of incapacitation slowed enough for a larger proportion of civilians to reach the exits under their own power. Naruto's shadow clones handled the sound shinobi in the civilian corridor. He created 30 of them in 4 seconds, which was a number that was difficult for any reasonable tactical calculation to account for, and the corridor engagement was over in 90 seconds. Karen's chain seals engaged the sound shinobi pressing through the western stadium wall, her Uzumaki vitality allowing her to maintain the sustained seal deployment that would have exhausted most practitioners in a third of the time. And Rei was working in the central arena with the precision of someone who had been in multiple operational engagements, and whose body had a deep institutional memory for this specific quality of situation. The Grade 1 curse spirit presented itself in the 6th minute. He had known it was coming. He had been tracking the cursed energy build in the stadium district since the preliminary matches 3 weeks earlier, noting the rate of accumulation with the unease of someone who can see what is building and cannot address it before it fully forms. The invasion's concentrated violence and fear had accelerated the final stages of the entity's development by an order of magnitude, and what had been a potential Grade 1 2 weeks ago was a definitive Grade 1 now, coherent and purposeful and responding to the invasion's emotional intensity by expanding through the stadium's subterranean structure toward the largest concentration of human suffering. He told Rei with 2 words. Her response was immediate and practical. Can you contain it? I need the domain, he said. Full externalization. 4 minutes minimum to establish the containment field at Grade 1 scale. What do you need? Clear space and 4 minutes. You have 3, she said. Work faster. He worked faster. The domain externalized in 1 minute 40 seconds, which was the fastest he had achieved and which was facilitated by the ambient cursed energy density that the invasion had generated, the same principle he had identified in the Forest of Death. The conditions that made the entities dangerous were also the conditions that made the domain most effective. The Grade 1 felt the domain field and turned toward it. He was standing at the center of the externalized domain in the subterranean passage beneath the stadium's eastern section, and the Grade 1 came through the passage wall in a way that was not physically possible for anything that operated on standard physical rules. And it was large enough that when it oriented toward him and registered the domain field's resonance signature, the passage shook with the specific quality of something very old paying very complete attention. He held the domain, and kept his attention from narrowing. This was the thing he had been working on since the first externalization. The quality of presence that the domain required was different from the focused intensity of combat. Combat wanted attention to sharpen. The domain wanted attention to expand, to hold the entire field simultaneously without collapsing it into a single point. The 2 modes were almost opposite, and maintaining the domain under the direct orientation of a Grade 1 entity required holding the expansive quality of attention against every instinct that said narrow and focus and act. He breathed. He held the domain. The Grade 1 tested the field in the way of large and coherent entities, which was not the clumsy forward pressure of non-sapient spirits but the careful, methodical probing of something that was assessing the nature of what it was encountering. He read the assessment in the way the entity's cursed energy moved, not retreating, not attacking, but investigating. He let it investigate. He kept the domain stable and open and did not narrow it, and did not force the engagement, and the Grade 1 investigated the resonance architecture with the patient attention of something that had not encountered this configuration before, and was determining what it meant. After 2 minutes and 40 seconds of investigation, the entity did something he had not anticipated. It spoke. Not in language. Not in sound. In the specific register that the domain architecture had created, a space where cursed energy was communicative rather than simply destructive, and what it communicated was not words but the direct experiential content of what it was, not grief but the weight that grief became when it had nowhere to go, not malice but the pressure of something that had been expanding because expansion was the only thing available to it. He received this with the domain's full expansive attention. He communicated back, in the same register, not words, not commands, but the resonance architecture's fundamental proposition, the thing all his seals said in their specific languages. The weight you carry can exist in a form that does not demand expansion. There is a different configuration available. The grade 1 was still for 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Then it contracted. Not all the way. Not into a sealed stone, which would have required the initialization protocol and the voluntary agreement component, but into a compressed, stable configuration that remained within the domain's field without pushing against its boundaries, a temporary equilibrium rather than a permanent binding. He held the domain for another 4 minutes, maintaining the field while the compressed entity remained stable, and then he began the staged release sequence he had developed theoretically but never had to use in a grade 1 context, slowly reducing the domain's external pressure while maintaining the resonance conditions, allowing the entity to inhabit the compressed configuration on its own rather than under active field pressure. The entity held the compressed configuration without the domain. He released the full externalization. He sat down on the passage floor, which he had not planned to do, and he breathed for a moment. Above him, the invasion was ending. He could hear it ending in the specific way that large operational situations ended, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of smaller conclusions, each one quieter than the last, the noise of conflict gradually replaced by the sounds of aftermath. Ray appeared in the passage entrance. She looked at the compressed entity, which was visible to her now through the residual resonance of the domain field, a dim shape in the passage's darkness that moved with the quality of something that was present but not threatening. She looked at Issei on the floor. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I need a minute." She sat down on the passage floor beside him, which was not something he had expected. They sat in the quiet passage and listened to the invasion end above them, and the compressed grade 1 remained in its voluntary configuration in the darkness ahead, and after a minute Issei stood up and began placing the anchor marks for the permanent containment array. Ray helped him with the anchor placement without being asked. Neither of them said anything about the moment of sitting on the floor. They did not need to. The Hokage's death in the confrontation above the stadium was announced 2 hours after the invasion's end. Issei received the information in the medical station where Team 7 had been directed for post-engagement assessment, from a jonin who delivered it with the specific flat voice of someone carrying news that is too large for the normal registers. He sat with it. Hiruzen Sarutobi had been the person who had given him archive access at 7 years old, who had issued an official designation for an 8-year-old academy student, who had received the 47 entry list and responded by providing structure and support rather than restriction, who had, in the office meeting 3 months ago, accepted the name Resonance Sorcery with the expression of a man who understood that the name was going to be permanent. He sat with the weight of this for a long time. Naruto was beside him, not saying anything, which was its own kind of loudness. Karen had gone very still in the way she went still when something had reached a part of her that was not protected by competence and analysis. Ray was standing at the edge of the medical station looking at the stadium with the expression of someone who was holding many things simultaneously, and had decided to hold them quietly. Eventually Issei looked up. He knew this was a possibility, he said. He operated in a world where this was always a possibility. He made the decisions he made knowing that. That does not make it smaller, Karen said. No, he said. It does not. A pause. What it does, he said slowly, is tell us what the work is for. He understood what we were building. He gave us the space to build it because he understood what it was for. That understanding does not end with him. It becomes the responsibility of the people he gave the space to. Naruto was looking at him. You are saying we continue, Naruto said. I am saying we continue because that is what he made possible, Issei said. Stopping would be a different kind of honoring than continuing. And he was not the kind of person who would have wanted the honoring kind. Ray turned from the stadium. No, she said. He was not. They sat in the medical station as the village settled into the beginning of the aftermath, and the work that the old man had named and supported continued in the way that work continues when the people doing it understand what it is for. Chapter 20. After the exams, before the next thing. The weeks following the invasion had a specific quality that Issei had not encountered before, which he eventually classified as the texture of a world that has been shaken and is in the process of settling into a new configuration that has not yet fully resolved. The village was managing its grief and its assessment of what had happened simultaneously. The Chunin exams had been suspended, the results to be determined by the available preliminary data rather than the incomplete final stage. The political situation with Sand Village had opened several rapid channels of communication, the alliance having dissolved the moment Temari and Conqueror understood what Orochimaru had used them for. There was a Hokage succession question that was generating the specific quality of institutional uncertainty that accumulated as cursed energy particularly fast. He addressed 3 new Grade 4 entities in the village within the week following the invasion, all of them grown substantially on the concentrated grief and fear of the event. He addressed them alone, quickly and cleanly, and did not report them to the institutional structure because the institutional structure was currently occupied with larger-scale matters and the Grade 4s were within his established independent operational capacity. He also began, in the evenings, writing up the pass-forward document that the Hokage's absence made necessary. The pass-forward document was for whoever assumed the Hokage position. It was a complete account of the resonance sorcery work, the classification system, the containment protocols, the domain architecture theory, the living seal recovery, the long-term project list including the Hyuga branching seal and the Shikaku situation and the Grade 1 entity currently in compressed voluntary configuration in the subterranean passage. It was written to be comprehensible to someone without direct exposure to the work, which meant it required a level of explanatory thoroughness that was new for a document that had previously been written for people who were part of the work. He worked on it for 3 evenings. Karen reviewed it. She made 8 changes, all of them improvements to the clarity of technical passages where his familiarity with the material had led him to compress explanations that a reader without his context would need expanded. He accepted all 8 changes. Sai contributed the illustrated classification appendix, which he had been updating continuously since the original document, and which was now a 40-page visual taxonomy that was, Issei had concluded, the single most immediately accessible piece of the entire body of work. He brought the complete document to the interim council that was handling village administration in the succession gap, with Rei present as his team's jonin and as a person whose published theoretical work gave her independent credibility within the institutional context. The council received the document with the specific quality of attention that very busy people gave to things that were too significant to defer and too large to absorb quickly. One of the members, a senior jonin who had been on the council for 15 years, read the first 12 pages during the meeting and then looked up and said, "How long has this been happening?" "The cursed spirit work began when I was 5, Issei said. "The formal documentation is 3 years old. The institutional acknowledgement is 4 months old." "In this village," the senior jonin said. "Under the previous Hokage's authorization." "Yes." "Without public knowledge." "Yes." The previous Hokage's assessment was that public knowledge without an established response framework would generate fear that would accelerate the cursed energy accumulation it was trying to address. I agreed with that assessment. The council looked at each other. "We will need," said a second member, "to discuss the transition of this authorization." "I understand," Issei said. I asked that the work continue during the discussion period. The entities in the village do not pause for institutional transitions. A pause. "Approved," said the senior jonin, after a look around the table. The existing authorization remains active during the succession discussion. He left the council meeting with the document submitted and the work continuing, and he stood in the street outside the council building in the late afternoon of a Konoha autumn, and thought about the shape of everything. Gaara came to the village 3 weeks after the invasion, not as a delegate. Not with diplomatic authorization. He came alone, through the gates, with his siblings 2 steps behind him and the sand in a low, slow orbit, and the specific quality of someone who has made a decision that required considerable internal work to arrive at, and is now inhabiting it without apology. He found Issei in the training ground, which was where he usually was at that time of day, and he stood at the edge of the ground and said, "I want to continue the work we started." Issei looked at him. 3 weeks had done something to the quality of Gaara's presence that was not dramatic but was real. The absolute compressed isolation of the person he had met in the forest was still there, structural rather than casual, not going away in 3 weeks. But there was something adjacent to it that had not been there before, a very small, very careful opening in a thing that had been entirely closed. Karen's analysis of the living seal initialization requirements is ready for the next stage, Issei said. The resonance contact framework for Shikaku is approximately 70% complete. I was planning to finish the remaining 30% before attempting anything practical. When will the 30% be complete? Gaara said. A month. Perhaps 6 weeks. Gaara looked at the training ground. I can stay, he said. In Konoha. For that long. It requires Sand Village authorization, which Temari is negotiating. Issei looked at him. You asked her to negotiate it, he said. Yes. And she agreed. She said? Gaara paused. She said that if this works it is worth whatever the political inconvenience of the negotiation costs. She also said several other things about me finally doing something that was not about killing everyone. Temari is direct. Yes. Something moved in Gaara's expression that was not quite a smile but occupied some of the same conceptual space. She and Karen will probably get along. Issei thought about this. He thought about Karen's directness and Temari's directness, and the specific kind of productive friction that two very direct people who were working toward the same goal generated between them. Yes, he said. They probably will. He went back to the training ground where Karen and Naruto were waiting and he brought Gaara with him, and he introduced them, and Karen looked at Gaara with the specific measuring expression she wore when she was determining where someone fit in the architecture of the work, and then she looked at the secured case with the living seal protocol and back at Gaara. We need 3 things, she said, with the directness of someone who has been thinking about this problem and is ready to discuss it rather than approach it. A complete characterization of Shikaku's sapience parameters. A voluntary agreement from Shikaku itself, which requires the resonance contact framework to be complete. And a modification of the standard initialization protocol to account for the fact that one party in the agreement is a tailed beast rather than a cursed spirit. She paused. The first and third I have been working on. The second requires you and the framework Issei is building. Together those 3 things constitute a complete approach. Gaara was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. All right, Karen said. Naruto was looking at Gaara with the specific quality of attention he gave to people whose situations he recognized in his own, the recognition that did not need to be stated to be felt. He said nothing. He simply nodded once, the nod of someone extending something without naming it. Gaara received it. Hinata was in the hospital for 8 days after the Niji match. Issei visited on the 5th day, which was when the medical staff cleared visitors for non-family. He brought the Uzumaki archive notes that she had been helping to catalog before the exams, in case she wanted something to look at, and a second thing that he had been carrying for 3 weeks and had decided was time to deliver. She was sitting up when he came in, looking better than the 4th day by the 6 eyes read of her recovery metrics, her chakra signature carrying the steady quality of someone healing correctly rather than fighting the process. She looked at him when he came in and smiled, which was the specific smile she gave him when she was genuinely pleased to see him rather than performing pleasedness, and he received it and sat in the visitor's chair. They talked about the archive work for a while. She had questions about the 3rd Whirlpool scroll that Karen had translated during the preparation month, and he answered them with the thoroughness she deserved. She made notes in the margin of a document with her usual careful hand. Then she set the pen down and looked at him. You said something, she said, before my match? About why you watched me specifically. He had said, the watching started because you were interesting and has continued because you matter. He had known, when he said it, that it was one of the more honest things he had said to another person in either of his lives, and that its honesty was not a function of strategy or calculation but of the specific quality of the moment. Yes, he said. I have been thinking about it for 8 days, she said. In the hospital it turns out there is a great deal of time to think about things. He waited. I am not very good, she said carefully, at saying things directly. I have been working on it for a long time. The work is ongoing. She looked at her hands for a moment. But I want to say something directly because I think it is the right register for this particular thing. He was paying complete attention. This was not unusual, he paid complete attention to most things. But there was a specific quality to this attention that he did not have a category for. You are the most unusual person I have ever met, she said. And I do not mean unusual as a description of your abilities. I mean unusual as a description of the way you are present with people. You see things and you do not use what you see to get something from people. You use it to understand them. And then you stay. She looked up at him. I noticed that too, she said. That you stay. Most people, when they see as much as you do, they use it to keep their distance. You do the opposite. The hospital room was quiet. Outside the window the village was going about its afternoon, the sounds of ordinary life filtering in through the glass. He thought about his mother on the garden wall telling him not to forget to let people in. He thought about Sai in the basement study room and Karen with the whirlpool scroll and Naruto sitting cross-legged on the forest floor reading the classification system. He thought about Rei on the training ground fence in the late evening. He thought about Gaara on the path in the forest of death. He thought about all the people he had been letting in, carefully and imperfectly and with growing ease over the years of this life. Yes, he said. I try to stay. I know, she said. That is what I wanted to say directly. That I notice it, and that it matters. He looked at her, and the 6 eyes read her chakra signature as open and completely without reservation, and the Sharingan showed him her expression in its complete, unambiguous truth, and what he received from both of those sources was something that the catalog did not have a pre-existing entry for. He made a new entry. Thank you, he said. For saying it directly. Thank you, she said, for making it possible to say. Jiraiya came to the village 2 weeks after the invasion and left again 4 days later, having assessed the situation and the succession question and the field conditions in the way of a person who has been operating at a certain level of awareness for long enough that the assessment was essentially instantaneous. Before he left, he spent 3 hours with Issei. This had been the Hokage's arrangement, documented in a letter that the council had found in Hiruzen's office among the materials related to the resonance sorcery classification. The letter had directed Jiraiya to speak with Issei specifically about 2 subjects, the Grade 1 entity in compressed voluntary configuration, and the relationship between the 9 tails chakra and cursed energy. Jiraiya was not what the legend suggested, in the specific way that legends were always inadequate to the people they described. He was perceptive in a way that operated differently from the 6 eyes, less systematic and more instinctive, reading people and situations through a long accumulation of experience that had built a pattern recognition capacity that looked like wisdom from the outside. He was also, underneath the performance of easy self-confidence, someone who carried significant grief of his own, the specific quality of a person who has outlived several things they loved. He listened to the Grade 1 briefing without interrupting. He listened to the 9 tails cursed energy analysis with the focused attention of someone receiving information that was changing his model of a system he had been working with for decades. The voluntary configuration, he said, after the briefing. The entity is maintaining it without the domain field active. Yes. It has been maintaining it for 3 weeks. The resonance contact during the invasion appears to have provided it an alternative mode of existence that it is choosing to inhabit. It is choosing, Jiraiya said. Yes. That is what distinguishes Grade 1 and above from lower grade entities. Sapience. The capacity for choice. The old Sannin was quiet for a while. The 9 tails, he said. If the relationship between its chakra and cursed energy is foundational rather than incidental. If Naruto's interaction with it has been shaped by the same principles that your domain operates on, just without the theoretical framework. That is my hypothesis, Issei said. Naruto's quality of connection with people, his ability to reach things that should not be reachable, his fundamental refusal to accept that anything is beyond resolution. These are consistent with someone who has been in active resonance with a being of enormous emotional energy since before they were born, and whose own emotional architecture has been shaped by that resonance. Jiraiya looked at him. You are telling me that Naruto is what he is, he said slowly. Partly because of the 9 tails. Not despite it. I am telling you that the 9 tails is what it is partly because of Naruto, Issei said. The relationship is not one-directional. It never has been. Naruto's specific quality of being has been shaping the 9 tails relationship to its own containment for 12 years. That is what a living seal does. Both parties change. Jiraiya sat with this for a long time. I am going to need, he said finally, a copy of your documentation. I have a copy prepared, Issei said. He had prepared it 3 days ago, knowing from the Hokage's letter that this conversation was coming. Jiraiya took the documentation. He stood and looked at Issei with the expression of a man who has been surprised by something and is deciding how to hold the surprise. Hiruzen, he said, wrote to me about you. Not in the letter with the documentation. In a separate letter. He said that in 50 years of watching people grow into what they were going to be, he had seen 2 categories. People who became remarkable because the world pushed them, and people who became remarkable because the world could not stop them. A pause. He said you were the second kind. Issei thought about the notebook at 7 years old and the first containment seal and the 4 years of domain architecture, and the grade 1 in the passage and Hinata's smile in the hospital room and Gaara's sand in a lower orbit, and Naruto reading the classification system in the forest. I had help, he said. The best ones always say that, Jiraiya said, and left. The evening after Jiraiya's departure, Issei sat in the grove at the eastern edge of the Uchiha compound where he had built his first containment seal 8 years earlier. The sealed stone was still there, the seal still stable, the first grade 4 of the 47 contained and holding quietly in its long agreement. The grove was different from how it had been 8 years ago. The compound around it was different. The emotional weight that had accumulated here for years, the grief and the alienation and the slow-building resentment that had once fed the cursed spirits growing in every corner, was lighter. Not gone, grief did not simply disappear because its worst expressions were addressed. But lighter. The way a room is lighter when the windows have been opened. He sat in the grove and thought about the shape of things. The resonance sorcery work was in the world now, named and documented and institutionally acknowledged. The grade 1 in the passage was in voluntary configuration. The Shikaka framework was 70% complete. The Hyuga branching seal was on the long-term project list. The Hokage succession would produce someone who had access to the complete documentation. There was more to do. There would always be more to do. The cursed energy in the world was generated by human suffering, and human suffering was not a solvable problem in the sense of being something that could be made to stop. It could be addressed at the level of accumulation, which was what his work did, reduce the most dangerous expressions, provide containment for the things that had grown beyond their source, create conditions in which the weight people carried was a little less heavy than it would otherwise be. That was not everything. But it was something real. Drake had been quiet for a while. The gear pulsed once, slow and steady, in the rhythm of a being that was present and attentive. You are thinking about all of it, the dragon said. Yes, Issei said. And I think, Issei said slowly, that I am beginning to understand the shape of the thing I was born to build. Not completely. The shape is still emerging. But the outline is becoming visible. The grove was quiet. Somewhere in the compound his mother was in the kitchen, the sound of her moving through the evening preparation carrying through the still air. His father was in the study, working through whatever he was working through, which was always several things simultaneously. The dragon sorcerer, Drake said. There was something in his voice that was not quite humor but shared the resonance of it. Resonance sorcerer, Issei said. The sorcerer supreme, if you want to be dramatic about it. Issei looked at the sealed stone from 8 years ago. He thought about the word supreme in the context of a 12-year-old sitting in his family's grove in the early evening of an autumn that was settling into something new. That is very dramatic, he said. You sealed the grade 1 during an invasion, Drake said. You are building an architecture that does not exist anywhere else in this world. Your domain is the most advanced sealed resonance structure in the elemental nations. You are 12 years old. A pause. I think a little drama is appropriate. Issei was quiet for a moment. Then, in the specific way of a person who is aware of the irony and is choosing to accept it anyway, he said, All right. Sorcerer Supreme. Provisionally. Drake made the sound that was his version of a laugh, deep and resonant, the voice of something that had been old when the world was young, finding something genuinely worth laughing at. The grove held its evening quiet. The fur-sealed stones sat in its tree. The compound lights came on one by one as the dusk deepened, warm and steady, the dark places smaller than they had been, the work continuing, the shape of everything emerging from the outline of what it was becoming. He stayed in the grove until the stars came out, cataloging them by habit, then letting the catalog go and simply sitting with the evening, the way his mother had taught him. He was 12 years old, and the world was large, and he was not done.